Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're filling the hush between midnight and morning, watching softly through a rain-streaked window, or winding down beneath a sky without stars, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're returning to the vast and quiet world of the Stone Age. Life before civilization, before cities, before memory. This is patient storytelling and slow science for curious minds. This is the untold history of human time. A tale shaped by more than 3 million years of silence, of stone, of survival. But it's not the story of invention and progress. It begins not with a spark, but with a question. Who were we before we were anyone at all? Oh, and if you're someone who values wonder, science, and quiet reflection, look just below this video. You'll see a button that says subscribe. Tap or press it anytime. You can always unsubscribe later. And if you tap the little bell icon next to it, you'll be gently notified when new stories arrive. Subscribing is the only way this channel survives. It helps us keep making these deep, careful videos for fellow sapiens like you. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing it in the comments, it reminds us that this story is unfolding in many places at once. Also, if you do fall asleep, no worries. Timestamps are waiting in the description. Now, we begin with a silence older than memory. Before there were cities, or writing, or names. There was this, a world unmarked by human hands, a vast planet spinning quietly through the dark, alive with storms and stars but absent of memory. This is not the story of civilization. This is the story of everything that came before it. Everything we know about the Stone Age, and the long breath of time that led to it. Life before temples, before tools, before the very notion of history. If we are to understand where humanity begins, we must begin not with ourselves, but with silence. For nearly 4.5 billion years the Earth existed without a single thought cast upon it. Oceans surged, mountains rose and collapsed, continents drifted like forgotten thoughts across a mantle of fire. In the beginning there was no sound but thunder, no voices, no stories, only pressure and heat and the slow geology of becoming. What is 1 million years to a planet? What is 1 billion? Can the human mind truly hold such distances, or do we only ever measure time by the weight of our own presence? The crust of the earth, so solid beneath our feet, is a mosaic of violence and accident. The continents we walk were once underwater, then crushed by ice, then lifted by invisible tectonic dreams. Fossils of trilobites lie buried in deserts. Coral reefs are found in mountain peaks. Forests once roared where there is now tundra. And through all of it, not a single human eye had yet opened to see. Long before there was anything called culture, there were climates and cataclysms. The Hadean and Archean eons, alien in their atmospheres, saw the formation of oceans and the first flicker of microbial life. For billions of years, life remained invisible, single-celled, microscopic, mute. The biosphere evolved slowly, sculpting itself in layers of photosynthesis and respiration. The air we breathe today was exhaled by ancient bacteria. Even the stone beneath our cities holds the memory of time's earliest breath. But this story does not belong to cells alone. It belongs to the future shape they would take. Evolution, relentless and blind, began to sketch more complicated things. Fins, spines, eyes. Life crawled from the sea. It climbed, slithered, ran. It died and was reborn. Mass extinctions erased entire genealogies. Comets struck. Volcanoes wept ash across the sky for years. But in all this deep time theatre, where was the mind? The first mammals came and went. Dinosaurs ruled for 160 million years. They too vanished. And eventually some small primates began their cautious experiments in the canopy. They had no civilization. No language, no memory, no fire. But something stirred. A glance, a hesitation, a hand held slightly longer over a stone. What must it have felt like, to be the first creature to almost remember? We speak so often of progress, of the ladder we've climbed, but before there was anything to climb from, there was only the ground. And the earth, indifferent to our future, kept turning. Even now, if you close your eyes and try to imagine the world before us, what do you see? Forests, perhaps, or beasts, or storms. But the deeper truth is stranger still. For much of Earth's history there were no eyes to witness beauty, no ears to hear birdsong, no words to mark the passage of days. Time moved, but it was not counted. Light fell, but it was not named. The Earth was not waiting for us. It simply was. In East Africa, near the Rift Valley, the land began to tear itself apart. Tectonic plates shifted, cracking open a corridor that would one day become the cradle of our kind. It was a place of extremes, arid plains, volcanic upheaval, lush oases. Ecosystems collided. Climate fluctuated violently. Rainforests gave way to grasslands and back again. It was not a stable world, but a testing ground. In this unstable theatre, the ancestors of humanity emerged, not through divine order or linear progress, but through a slow unfolding of chance and adaptation. The earliest hominins were not hunters of mammoth or painters of caves. They were upright apes, cautious and clever, scavengers more than predators, shaped by scarcity and sunlight. Australopithecus afarensis, a name we have given to bones, once walked where lions now sleep. She left behind footprints in volcanic ash nearly 4 million years ago. She had no language. She had no myths. But she walked, upright, into a world that would one day remember her. Why there? Why then? What strange convergence of drought and mutation gave rise to a new lineage of ape? Scientists speak of aridification, of savannas replacing dense forests, of bipedalism offering survival at a distance. But even as we study the sediment and pollen and isotopes, we are left with the same question. Why did the mind begin here, and not elsewhere? What secret did the soil whisper to make thought inevitable? The earth gave nothing easily. Droughts came in cycles, food disappeared, bodies shrank and teeth changed. Those who adapted lived. Those who didn't vanished. There was no grand plan, only the brutal mathematics of survival. But hidden within these random equations was a strange side effect. Intelligence. Brains began to grow. Social bonds became more intricate. A mother watched her child longer. A gesture lasted a moment too long. A rock struck another rock, and something new was born. Intention. The story of the Stone Age does not begin with tools. It begins with the environment that made tools necessary. It begins with the landscape pushing minds to wake up. Evolution is not a ladder. It is a tide. It rises, recedes, and leaves behind strange forms. And somewhere in that rising tide, something like us began to emerge. But what does it mean to be like us before anything we associate with humanity even existed? What happens when memory lives only in the body, and not in words? What is a mind before it can speak? Is it still human, or something else entirely? A prelude, a ghost, a flicker of what might one day be consciousness. In that vast stretch of prehistory, there were no myths to bind people together, no altars to kneel before, no names to remember the dead. And yet, the bones tell us there was life, uncertain, trembling, experimental. A life defined not by culture, but by the raw proximity to nature's indifference. To live then was to exist within the teeth of the world, where every breath might be your last and every sunrise was a silent reprieve. There was no art, no architecture, no carved idols or woven tales. There were only bodies, moving, watching, surviving. Hands grasped fruit, eyes scanned for predators, nostrils flared at the scent of decay. Everything that mattered was immediate, and yet, even in this immediacy, something was taking shape beneath the surface. Culture did not emerge fully formed. It seeped slowly into being. What came before culture, then, was potential. We often think of civilization as the measure of humanity. But long before roads and empires, there was the body, the stone, the fire. The gaze held a second too long. Before language, there was touch. Before ritual, there was pattern. To understand the Stone Age, we must unlearn the metrics of modern life. There were no borders, no nations, not even tribes in the sense we know them. There was only proximity, to death, to hunger, to each other. And in this proximity, a quiet miracle unfolded. Connection. Not in words, but in mimicry, in gesture, in imitation. A child learned not by being told, but by watching. A mother passed knowledge not through speech, but through motion. A gesture became a tradition. A path worn through the grass became a route remembered. These are the ghostly roots of culture. Culture before symbols, before structure, before story. What does it mean to live before culture? It means living without maps, without clocks, without measurement. It means that everything sacred was immediate. The warmth of the sun, the shadow of a tree, the stillness of night. These early hominins did not ask who they were. They were, and in being they carried forward the first unspoken answers to questions they could not yet form. We often search for ourselves in the artifacts we unearth, in the shaped tools, in the bones carefully buried, in the pigments left on cave walls. But before any of that, there was presence. Before the stone was struck with intention, the hand had to learn to hesitate, to choose, to consider. That moment, the pause before action, may be the oldest trace of the mind as we know it. Not the tool itself, but the silence that preceded it. Could it be that the truest beginning of humanity is not marked by a creation, but by a hesitation? A moment of stillness in which one being looked at the world and wondered what else was possible. That hesitation, subtle, invisible, is perhaps the quiet heartbeat of everything to come. Civilization did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with waiting, watching, enduring. Long before agriculture, long before cities, long before the concept of ownership or worship or law, there were creatures who paused and noticed. And what they noticed was not trivial. A pattern in the movement of the herds, the curve of a branch shaped just so, the changing sky before the rains. These recognitions formed no language, no record, but they shaped behavior, they shaped memory, they shaped choice. The foundation of civilization is not stone, it is awareness. There is a temptation in modern minds to look backward and see only absence. No writing, no architecture, no politics. But absence is not emptiness. The pre-civilized world was rich in other ways. Rich in motion, rich in instinct, rich in the raw intimacy of living close to death, close to birth, close to the edge of becoming. In that closeness, bonds were formed not by contract but by necessity. Kinship was not a label, it was a survival strategy. We do not know if the first hominins loved. We cannot say if they mourned, or dreamed, or feared the dark in the same ways we do. But we know they endured. And endurance, too, is a kind of knowledge. It is passed on not through books, but through the body. The way a child leans into its mother. The way a group gathers when the wind changes. These are not customs. They are the skeleton of what customs would one day become. To live before culture was to live in the raw continuity of nature. The cycles of day and night, of hunger and rain, were not abstract. They were sovereign. The world did not bend to human will. The human will bent to the world. Fire was not yet a servant. It was a mystery, a predator, a distant promise flickering in volcanic vents and lightning strikes. Shelter was not architecture. It was improvisation. And yet, even in this improvisation, there was elegance, simplicity honed by time. The way a nest is elegant, the way a beehive or a bird's call contains the echoes of a million repetitions. This was the era before symbols, but it was not before meaning. Meaning was there, silent, embodied, and unspoken. What happens when a creature becomes aware not only of the world, but of its own awareness? When the gaze that once scanned for predators begins to linger on the stars, or on the face of another? That shift, gradual, imperceptible, may be the soft birth of what we now call mind, and with it, the first silent crack in the wall that separates instinct from intention. There, in that fragile gap, humanity begins, not with a monument or a myth, but with a pause, a glance, a momentary reaching towards something not yet real. This is the liminal space before culture, before language, before even memory could be recorded. And yet it is within this space that the first threads of everything we now take for granted were quietly woven. It is a strange thought, that the foundation of civilization rests not on invention, but on attention. That the first tools, the first sparks, the first steps toward what we now call history, were born not in noise or proclamation, but in the silence before time. a silence that held the weight of every life lived without leaving a mark we could name, a silence so vast that it swallowed 1,000,000 generations and still echoes just beneath our feet. The earth remembers even when we do not. It remembers through stone, through dust, through layers of soil compressed by time into a kind of forgotten scripture. Fossils and sediments, pollen and ash. These are the pages of a book without words, a book we're only now beginning to read. And what we find written there is not the story of empires, but of endurance. Not the triumph of the few, but the patience of the many. The slow, ancient art of staying alive. What must it have felt like to live in a world without boundaries, without mirrors, without even the concept of self? When each day was a negotiation with wind, with water, with hunger and heat. Was there wonder then, even before the word for wonder existed? Was there awe when the sky changed colour, when fire danced across the horizon in a storm? Before the first village, before the first god, before the first story. There was only this, a body, a world, and the unspoken question between them. That question, raw, unanswerable, was not shouted into the void. It was carried, generation after generation. In the gait of a hominin walking upright through the grasslands, in the tilt of a head turning toward a sound, in the pressure of a hand on a stone, everything we know about the Stone Age begins here, in the time before knowing had a name. The geological clock had ticked for billions of years, but now something was listening. Something had begun to see. The Earth, once indifferent, now had witnesses. So what do we call this prelude to civilization? It is not prehistory. It is not ignorance. It is not darkness. It is becoming. It is the long inhale before the song, the silence before the word, the stillness before memory takes form, and perhaps, even now, some part of that stillness remains within us, not as a relic, but as a root. As the echo of a time when being alive was the only story we needed to tell, and so, the journey begins, not with noise, but with a hush so deep it could swallow stars, not with a monument, but with a footprint, not with answers, but with the first question no one yet knew how to ask. Somewhere in the dappled green of an ancient African forest, an ape stood up, not for the first time, but for a little longer than before, perhaps to peer across the tall grass, perhaps to reach a hanging fruit, or perhaps for no reason at all, just a fleeting imbalance. But in that moment something changed. Upright, exposed, uncertain, and yet somehow aware. The eyes scanned not just for danger, but for something else. A path, a shape, a pattern in the world not immediately useful, but strangely compelling. That was the beginning. That was the flicker. The story of humanity's birth is not one of inevitability. It is a tale of branching trees, of evolutionary experiments, of cousins lost to time. Australopithecus walked the earth long before us, light-boned and long-limbed, part climber, part walker, part mystery. But it was around 2.5 million years ago that something quietly radical occurred. The rise of the genus Homo, not in a single moment, but in a slow unravelling, as one population of hominins began to shift. Their jaws grew smaller, their brains larger. Their tools, crude as they were, began to hold memory in their edges. They were not us, but they were becoming. What must it have felt like to be one of them? To live in a world where your body was still animal but your mind was not. They did not yet have language, not fully. But perhaps they gestured with more nuance. Perhaps they paused, puzzled over a carcass, and thought longer than instinct alone would require. In their hands, the first tools of Homo habilis, the handy man, bore the marks not only of use but of thought. Stones split against stones, edges formed, the ache of purpose began to echo. This was not yet civilization. It was still raw, dangerous, exposed. Predators prowled, lifespans were short. But in the margins of survival, something emerged that could not be undone. Intentionality. These beings began to change the world around them, ever so slightly, with deliberation. A stone was not just picked up, it was shaped. A carcass was not just eaten, it was taken apart. The mind had begun to plan, if only by seconds. There is a strange nobility in the idea that our first ancestors were not conquerors, but cautious observers. They did not reshape the earth. They studied it. They listened. They watched the wind bend the trees, the vultures circle, the seasons shift, and somewhere in that long observation, the idea of cause and effect, of before and after, began to solidify, not as words, but as weight in the brain. But what does it mean to hold time inside your skull? What happens when a creature begins to remember not just places but patterns? To recognise that meat is easier to tear when a bone is broken first, that a certain stone splits cleaner than others, that the riverbed in dry season reveals treasures long buried beneath the flow. These are not mere reactions, they are rehearsals. They imply anticipation. And in that anticipation lies the root of imagination. Before the first story could be told, there had to be the ability to hold an event in the mind after it ended. Memory is not only a function, it is a kind of prophecy. It is the beginning of choice. The tools left behind by Homo habilis are simple, sharp flakes struck from river cobbles. But they are more than survival strategies. They are artifacts of intention. One cannot split a stone by accident, not like this. It takes precision, repetition. And repetition is ritual in its earliest form, not yet spiritual but mental, not yet symbolic but predictive. The hands that made them were changing too. Nerve pathways strengthening, dexterity improving, the brain growing slowly to meet the hand's ambition. By the time Homo erectus walked the earth, nearly 2 million years ago, that growth had accelerated. The brain was nearly double the size of Australopithecus. They were taller now, longer-legged, striding across vast distances. Some would leave Africa entirely. They reached the Caucasus, Southeast Asia, even the islands. The world was no longer a boundary. It was an invitation, and they answered, step by step, stone by stone. They made hand axes, teardrop-shaped, elegant, symmetrical, Acheulean tools. The first artifacts that show not just utility, but aesthetics. A symmetry that serves no clear function suggests something else. Perhaps an emerging sense of form, of rightness, of balance. Is that not the earliest echo of art? Could it be that the first artist was a hominin shaping a rock to a pattern only they understood? There is wonder in that possibility, that before fire was mastered, before language rose to articulate thought, there was already a desire to shape, not just to survive, but to express. The birth of the symbolic mind is not marked by a line in the dirt. It is a slow rising like light before dawn, a gradual emergence of complexity from a body that was once guided only by instinct. And with that complexity came new questions. Questions we cannot hear but must imagine. Did they wonder where the animals went in the dry season? Did they understand death as absence or as change? When lightning struck the ground and fire erupted, did they run or watch? When a baby cried, did they comfort or merely tolerate? What happens when a brain, evolved for motion and reaction, begins to carry weight it cannot name? What must it feel like to be the first being haunted by thoughts you can't yet speak? To feel a stirring behind the eyes, not hunger, not fear, but something else, a tension, a wondering, a shadow of curiosity that does not end with the thing it observes. This, perhaps more than any tool or footprint, is the birth of the mind. Not just cognition, but reflection. The beginning of a mind that does not simply act, but questions. The evidence left behind is sparse. We do not have their words. We do not know their names, but we have the shape of their skulls. We have the ridges of their tools. We have the paths of their migrations burned into the bones of the earth. And from these fragments, we piece together a portrait of awakening. Not an explosion, but a slow fire. The expansion of the hominin brain from roughly 400 cubic centimetres in Australopithecus to over 900 in Homo erectus is not merely a biological fact. It is a window into a new kind of existence. But what drives a brain to grow? Was it climate, complexity, the challenges of fire, of meat, of movement? Or was it each other? The group, the social web, the fragile need to cooperate just to survive another night? To track a prey animal across a savanna requires memory. To share a carcass without chaos demands restraint. To follow, to lead, to wait. These are not instincts alone. These are social calculations, the architecture of empathy. And slowly that architecture changed the brain. The prefrontal cortex thickened, neural pathways branched like trees, mirror neurons sparked, allowing one individual to feel, however dimly, the pain, the joy, the intention of another. The ape was no longer just reacting. It was beginning to infer, to imagine, to simulate. In that simulation, the world grew larger. Time lengthened. Possibility opened. There is a sacred strangeness in the fact that our ancestors were not driven by mastery, but by adaptation. They did not seek to rule the world. They sought to remain in it. And in doing so, they changed themselves. Fire was not yet tamed, not consistently, but it was watched, approached, feared, perhaps even preserved when found. A burning branch carried from one place to another. A smouldering log tended through the night. These are not the actions of beasts. These are the first rituals of continuity. With fire came warmth, light, and time. The night stretched longer. The shadows deepened. Around that flickering flame the mind had space to wander. Not just to react to the world, but to sit with it. To linger in memory. To rehearse a gesture. To invent a new one. To notice the way an old woman grips a tool, or how a child mimics his father's throw. Repetition becomes rhythm. Rhythm becomes teaching. When does teaching become tradition? And when does tradition become the first thread of culture? Somewhere between the strike of a stone and the passing of a gesture, meaning began to echo. Not just action, but continuity. Not just reaction, but memory preserved across generations. There is no monument to mark this transition. No artifact that declares, here is the first moment culture existed. And yet, in the archaeological record, we begin to see hints. Clusters of similar tools, repeated techniques, favoured materials that suggest knowledge passed down, not rediscovered each time anew. This is the quiet miracle of cultural transmission. Not language as we know it, but an embodied grammar of doing, a way of holding a flake, of striking with just the right angle, of choosing this stone over that. These are not random acts. They are lessons, practiced and remembered. The body becomes a vessel of knowledge. The tribe becomes a moving library, storing not books but behaviours. And slowly behaviour becomes story. Not in words, not yet, but in rhythm, in structure. A successful hunt becomes a pattern worth repeating. A path through the reeds becomes a trail, then a route, then a memory shared not in language but in footsteps. The early hominins likely lacked the vocal control required for full speech, but their throats could make sound. Their hands could move, their faces could express. In these primal signals we find the roots of something deeper, symbolic thought. Symbolic thought is not the same as symbolism. It is the ability to let one thing stand for another, a gesture for a meaning, a sound for a desire, a mark for a memory. Before there could be gods, there had to be signs. Before there could be myths, there had to be metaphors. And this faculty, this strange human ability to project meaning, was stirring awake. The evidence, though rare, grows more haunting with each discovery. Simple engravings, zigzags etched into ochre, dating back more than 500,000 years, perhaps made by Homo erectus. Do they mean something? Or are they idle scratches? We cannot know. But the possibility is enough to make the mind reel. What does it mean for an ape to scratch a pattern into stone, not for survival, but for expression? Somewhere in these gestures, these primitive symbols, is the embryo of all that would come after: language, art, religion, architecture. Not as inevitabilities, but as whispers, as possibilities flickering in the neurons of a changing brain. Evolution had shaped the vessel. Now it seemed something within that vessel was beginning to dream. But dreams require time. Time to wander, to reflect, to imagine. And fire, that ancient flickering sun captured in wood, made time. Around it the day extended into night. Shadows danced on cave walls. Faces were illuminated. Hands passed food, tools, touch. Around fire the mind stretched further. A memory became a story. A fear became a warning. A gesture became a ritual. And so, the ape that once stood in the grass now sat by flame, and began quietly to wonder. What is this world? And what am I within it? There was no language yet to hold the question, but the weight of it pressed gently against the shape of their thoughts. The mind, once only a tool for motion and reaction, had become something else, a vessel for reflection. What was once instinct now had shadows. What was once a moment now had before and after. The world was no longer just a terrain to survive. It was becoming a place to be understood. The expansion of the brain brought costs. Bigger heads meant more dangerous births. Longer childhoods meant more caregiving. But the payoff was staggering. With each generation, cognition deepened. Planning became foresight. Problem-solving became imagination. And slowly, the neural machinery of symbolism began to hum. Not fully, not as we know it, but enough to leave traces, faint and ancient, in the bones, the tools, the quiet changes of behaviour. And it is here that something profoundly human emerges, the first sense that there is more to the world than what is seen. Symbolic thought is not just about tools or patterns. It is about layers. It is about presence and absence, about memory and longing. The realization that something can be gone and still matter, that a person can disappear and still be held in mind. This is the birthplace of mourning, of storytelling, of gods. But long before gods had names, or stories had structure, or tribes had songs, there was this, a brain holding an image that was not present, a child recalling a path, a woman remembering a face, a man lifting a tool and imagining how it might change. These are the first roots of what would one day become culture. They did not yet sculpt idols, but they remembered the shape of fire. They did not yet draw on walls, but they traced meaning in the dirt. They did not yet pray, but they paused, and in that pause was reverence. So much of what we now call civilization began with nothing but a hand, a stone, and a question that had no words. What must it have felt like to live in that in-between, no longer beast, not yet human, and to feel something vast pressing against the inside of your skull? A pressure not of hunger or fear, but of curiosity, of awe. In the tangled forests and golden plains of Africa, that pressure became momentum, and the ape, once cautious and silent, began to explore, not just the land, but the mind. They were not yet us, but they carried us within them, in the arc of a brow, in the spark of an eye. In the moment they first turned to another and wondered what that other might be thinking, the journey had begun. The threshold had been crossed, and from that crossing the world would never be the same. Not because of what they built, but because they began to imagine building at all. And then they walked. It began in whispers, one family pushing farther into the savannah, another following the shadow of a migrating herd, a generation passing through a dry riverbed, then never returning. There were no maps, no borders, no destinations, only the rhythm of footsteps across dust and the quiet compulsion to go. Why does a creature leave everything it knows? What makes an animal wander? The first migration did not begin as a conquest. It began as an adaptation. Homo erectus, already taller, leaner, and more enduring than its ancestors, began to move. Out of Africa, slowly, almost invisibly, across shifting ecologies and deepening time. They followed food, followed water, followed nothing but the edge of what they knew. It was not a single exodus. It was many. Waves spread across thousands of years, rolling eastward into the Levant, into Asia, into islands and unknown continents. And wherever they went, they changed, and the world changed around them. These first walkers were not wanderers by whim. They were compelled by forces vast and invisible, droughts that reshaped landscapes, rains that failed for decades, ice that advanced like a slow, grinding breath. Climate was not a backdrop to their story. It was the script. The African continent itself shifted beneath them, lush forests shrinking into patchy woodlands, then into open grasslands. The cooling of the planet brought deserts where lakes once shimmered, carved corridors through stone and demanded choices, adapt, move, or vanish. Some moved north, where they encountered colder nights and harder terrain. Others followed coasts, where fish and shellfish offered a steady reward. And yet, despite the hardship, they kept walking, into the unknown, through snowfields and jungles, across highlands and floodplains. What must it have felt like to see the moon rise over a land your ancestors had never touched, to drink from rivers with no name, to sleep beneath unfamiliar stars? This migration, this outward unfolding of the human lineage, was not a race. It was a diffusion. A slow breathing out of presence. Archaeological remains from sites in Dmanisi, in modern-day Georgia, show Homo erectus present there nearly 2 million years ago. In Indonesia, tools and teeth whisper of human occupation long before most thought possible. These people were not us, not quite, but they carried the blueprint, the beginnings of planning, of adaptation, of the flexibility that would become humanity's greatest inheritance, and they were not alone. The world beyond Africa was not empty. Other branches of the hominin tree had already taken root. Some left no fossil record. Others left only traces in our blood. What happened when Homo erectus stepped into those new lands and saw another face, not quite theirs, but not entirely other? What happens when the self still forming meets the stranger who looks almost familiar? The question hangs over the archaeological record like a shadow cast by memory. Because when our ancestors stepped beyond Africa, they did not enter an untouched world. They entered a chorus of ghosts. There were others already out there. Homo floresiensis on distant islands, Homo lucenensis in the forests of the Philippines, and others whose names we will never know. Later, far to the north, there would be Neanderthals and Denisovans, cousins in both blood and bone. For millions of years, Earth was not a stage for one species. It was a crowded theatre of almost humans, and yet, somehow, our lineage kept moving. Not swiftly, not with conquest or plan, but with a kind of quiet inevitability. The fossil record shows it. A jawbone here, a tool there, ash buried beneath layers of time like breath held between epochs. Homo erectus became a wanderer, a craftsman, a survivor. They learned to make fire, not everywhere, not always, but enough to shape their nights. With fire came endurance. With endurance came possibility. But the world they walked was not stable. Ice ages came like the inhalations of the planet itself, vast glaciers expanding, contracting, reshaping everything in their wake. Grasslands gave way to deserts, deserts to forests, oceans rising and falling as if the earth were sighing in its sleep. To survive these cycles required more than strength. It demanded foresight, memory, and cooperation. It required a mind not just reacting to nature, but learning to anticipate it. What must it have felt like to live on such a restless earth, to walk for generations chasing the rain? To know that the land beneath your feet could vanish within a lifetime? There were no calendars, no maps to chart these movements, only memory carved into habit and stories etched into the roots themselves. Migration was not a single act. It was a rhythm, an inheritance passed from mother to child through the unbroken motion of footsteps. They followed animals, the great herds that mirrored their movement. They learned the pathways of antelope, the migrations of birds, the tides that brought fish close to shore. To move was not to flee. It was to live in conversation with the earth. And the earth answered back, with abundance and with famine, with gentle seasons and with storms. Each valley, each shoreline, each mountain pass was both teacher and test, and all the while the human mind grew. Homo erectus developed something extraordinary: persistence, the ability to chase prey not through ambush, but through endurance, tracking it across miles until it collapsed from exhaustion. This persistence required not only strength, but patience. It required communication, coordination, trust. Somewhere on those ancient plains, language took its first trembling breaths, not as poetry, but as survival. A gesture, a call, a shared glance that meant, now, together. What happens when words begin to take root in a species that already knows movement? What happens when thought becomes portable, carried like fire across the horizon? It spreads, not like a flame consuming all in its path, but like a seed on the wind, drifting, settling, waiting for the right conditions to take hold, and as it spread, the landscape itself became a memory. Rivers became signposts, mountains became boundaries, the path between watering holes became a thread woven through generations. The world was no longer just terrain, it was narrative, and the walkers were no longer just animals, they were the tellers of a story written with footsteps. By the time Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, somewhere around 300,000 years ago, the Earth had already been crisscrossed by 1,000 migrations, but this time something was different. These new humans carried not only the physical capacity to walk vast distances, but also a symbolic imagination powerful enough to bind groups together through belief, abstraction, and shared memory. They painted, they carved, they buried their dead, and eventually they too walked. The great exodus of Homo sapiens out of Africa, perhaps as early as 200,000 years ago, perhaps in pulses, perhaps in whispers, was not a military campaign. It was a scattering, small bands moving through Sinai, into Arabia, along coasts, up river valleys, into the frostbitten vastness of Eurasia. Some hugged the Indian Ocean, skirting the southern edge of Asia, arriving at the shores of Indonesia and beyond. Others turned inland, threading through mountains and grasslands, into Europe where the Neanderthals waited. What was it like when they met? Two species, similar and strange. Neanderthals had already mastered the cold. They buried their dead. They made tools with deliberate craftsmanship. Their brains were as large as ours, in some cases larger, and yet within a few tens of thousands of years they were gone. Not vanished overnight, not hunted into oblivion, but absorbed, displaced, outlasted. Some interbred. Their genes remain in us, in skin, in immunity, in the very marrow of our bones. But it wasn't only Neanderthals, there were others. Denisovans, known only from a few fragments, a tooth, a finger, a scrap of bone in a Siberian cave. And others still, unnamed, unclassified. Ghosts in our genome, traces of ancient liaisons in Melanesian blood, in Tibetan lungs, in tiny genetic threads that whisper, you are not alone in your ancestry. The migrations of our species were not straight lines. They were loops, spirals, braids. Populations split, merged, vanished. Some thrived in new lands, others perished before leaving a mark, and yet the movement continued, across deserts and glaciers, across volcanic fields and rising seas. Humans reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, perhaps by raft, perhaps by accident, perhaps by courage we can barely fathom. Who were the first to cross open water, to set sail without knowing what lay beyond the blue? What must it have felt like to step onto a shore where no fire had ever burned, where no footprint preceded yours? There is a kind of silence that surrounds that first step, not emptiness, but a fullness of possibility. The world was immense, unbounded, no borders, no nations, no names. Every forest was a question, every animal an encounter, every sky unfamiliar, and still they moved forward, from island to island, along coasts and rivers, through canyons and wind-worn plains. The human journey, this migration that began not with conquest but with curiosity, became the great unfolding of our species. What drove them onward? Hunger, yes. Drought, perhaps. But more than that, a capacity rare in the animal world, the ability to imagine what lay beyond the ridge, to wonder what might be over the hill, past the forest, beyond the reach of the stars. That kind of movement is not mechanical. It is mythic. It is an act of belief. And belief, however primitive, was beginning to bloom, not in temples or in texts, but in decisions, small daily decisions guided by trust, by memory, by stories murmured around the fire. If a child grew sick when the rains failed, if a herd disappeared and never returned, if a figure was glimpsed in the distance, how did the mind explain it? How did the tribe carry that moment forward? Teach it, encode it, remember. The journey shaped the species. Cold forged resilience, distance forged memory, isolation forged identity. And in every new land, humanity became something slightly different. In the high plateaus of Asia, adaptations formed thin air. In the dense forests of Southeast Asia, skills emerged for tracking in silence, reading canopy and shadow. In Northern Europe, clothes were sewn from hides, and fire became salvation. People did not simply conquer environments, they became them. And yet, the Earth was not passive. It pushed back. Tectonic shifts, volcanic winters, sudden freezes and thawings altered the terrain. Sometimes migration halted for generations, sometimes it reversed. A rising sea might isolate a once-connected land. A corridor of fertile ground might open between glaciers for only a few centuries. The planet itself became a gatekeeper, forcing humanity to adapt or disappear. Still, the walk continued. By 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens stood in the heart of Ice Age Europe. By 30,000, they'd reached the frigid steppes of Siberia, and still they pushed farther, toward the land bridge that once connected Asia to the Americas, across frozen tundra, into the white silence, into the teeth of wind. They would not arrive in waves, but in flickers, small bands carving paths through snow and shadow, their memories growing heavier with every step. What must it have meant to carry a fire through that kind of cold? To believe the sun would return though the sky had been dark for months? What kind of mind survives when the earth itself becomes the trial? One shaped not just for endurance, but for imagination. The cold may have blanched the skin, cracked the lips, bent the back, but it also sharpened foresight, deepened memory, and honed the instinct to cooperate. In the howling quiet of the Ice Age, survival was a collective act. No one person alone could hunt the mammoth or outlast the frost. It took the group, thinking together, moving together, sharing together, bound not only by blood, but by belief. That belief, the invisible thread that held them through hunger and storm, may be the oldest artifact of all. And so, across continents, the walkers continued, not in conquest, but in continuity, carrying fire, language, story, and something else, harder to name, a worldview. A way of relating to the earth that saw no border between the human and the natural, the spirit and the stone. To the migrating mind, everything was alive. Every mountain had a voice, every animal, a presence. This animism, not as religion, but as perception, made the world a place of relationships, not resources. By the time humans reached the furthest edges of the earth, the frostbitten reaches of Patagonia, the rain-soaked forests of the Pacific Northwest, the islands of Oceania, they were no longer simply migrants. They were stewards, carriers of memory, pattern, myth. The first migrations had not just filled the map, they had given birth to human diversity. Dozens of languages, hundreds of lifeways, 1,000 understandings of the sky. And yet, beneath that vastness, something remained constant, the walk itself. The gesture of leaving what is known, of seeking the horizon, that impulse to follow the call of the beyond, did not vanish when the continents were full. It turned inward. It became art, philosophy, story, ritual. The body stopped moving, but the mind did not. And still today, when we wonder what lies beyond our world, when we dream of other planets, other galaxies, we are echoing that first step out of Africa, that first glance beyond the tree line. We are still the walking ape. We are the child of migrations so ancient they outpace memory, yet live on in our bones. Every breath you take is filtered through the lungs of ancestors who walked, across deserts and glaciers, through forests and ash fields, never knowing where they were going, only that they must go. You are their map. You are the destination they never lived to see. And in that lineage of footsteps, in that tapestry of paths lost to time, there is no final chapter, only a circle. For movement is not merely historical, it is existential. We move because we must, because the world calls to us in silence, because the fire that lit our ancestors' path across the continents still burns behind our eyes. The first migration never ended. It lives on, in thought, in wonder, and in the quiet moment when you step into the unknown and feel, once again, the ancient earth beneath your feet. Around the hearth, shadows danced. Words, or something like them, passed between minds. Fire did more than warm the cold night. It forged the first social bonds, and in that flickering glow, humanity changed. Not suddenly, not with ceremony, but in the quiet repetition of gesture and gaze. Imagine the hush of evening, the slow arrival of darkness across a savanna clearing, the moment when a pile of dry grass crackles into flame. That fire was not only heat, it was memory made visible, a place to return to, a centre around which everything could begin to orbit. What does it mean to command a piece of the cosmos? The harnessing of fire was not a single invention, but a gradual intimacy, a learning to tend, to carry, to protect. Long before modern humans, even our distant cousins Homo erectus were likely masters of this elemental force. Nearly 2 million years ago, in places like Kubifora in Kenya and Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, Archaeologists find the faint residues of ancient hearths, charred bones, scorched soil, patterns of ash layered between stones, not accidental burns, not lightning's remnants. These are traces of attention, of care. To control fire is to control time. It transforms the raw into the edible, the night into a habitable place, the temporary camp into a ritual space. A flame does not merely persist, it must be sustained, fed, watched. It creates routine, rhythm, a shared purpose. And around it, something begins to happen that had never happened before in the animal world. Stillness. Not the frozen vigilance of prey, but a communal pause, a slowing down, a reason to gather. What fills the space between flames and faces? In that circle there was time. Time to look, to point, to gesture, to laugh. Perhaps not in words at first, but in signs, in tone, in mimicry. Around the fire, communication deepened. There are no fossils of sentences. Language does not fossilize, but the brain does. And its architecture tells a story of growing complexity. The parts that govern planning, memory, rhythm, all show expansion in tandem with the archaeological traces of long-term fire use. Some researchers believe the first true proto-languages, structured, shared, meaningful, may have taken root in these firelit gatherings. The fire became the first classroom, the first theatre, the first parliament, and not just for sharing information, but for shaping identity. Around the fire you became someone with a name, a role, a memory worth sharing. Did fire give birth to self-awareness? It might seem strange to attribute so much to something as simple as flame, but in deep time, simplicity is misleading. Fire is transformation made visible. It is a symbol, even when we do not yet have symbols. It turns one thing into another. And in doing so, it offered early humans a model of change, of cause and effect, of continuity. To feed the fire and see it live, to neglect it and see it die, was to encounter responsibility. When the first ape kept fire alive through a single cold night, did they know they were shaping the future of thought itself? The answer, of course, is no. And yet, in their persistence, something new took root. Fire demanded care. It could not be hoarded or hunted. It had to be maintained. And that act, the nightly tending of flame, wove patience into the rhythm of survival. For the first time, life was not only reaction but anticipation. Someone had to watch, to guard the embers, to feed them before dawn. In that ritual of attention, the human mind was learning continuity. To control fire was to domesticate time itself. Night, once the domain of predators, now became inhabitable. The dark, once feared, was transformed into a landscape of orange and gold. Light stretched the day beyond the horizon of the sun, allowing time for reflection, for repair, for imagination. Around the fire, the tribe no longer dissolved into sleep at dusk. They lingered, and in that lingering, thought deepened. Consider what happens when faces are illuminated by flame. Shadows move across skin, eyes catch light. Every gesture becomes a language. Every silence carries meaning. Fire made communication visible. It painted it. What was once a fleeting gesture became drama. What was once instinct became expression. Over thousands of generations, these performances in light and shadow sculpted the architecture of communication itself. Proto-language may not have begun with words, but with rhythm, the beat of a story told through gesture, breath, and tone. Laughter, cries, hums, the cadence of collective sound. Around the fire, sound had context. One voice rose, another answered. Emotion found resonance in a chorus of murmurs and echoes. It was here, perhaps, that syntax, the structure of shared thought, began to emerge. To make meaning is to see yourself mirrored in others. Fire gave humanity that mirror. It created the first space of empathy, not as abstraction, but as survival. To sit close to flame was to share vulnerability. The heat was communal, the darkness collective. To guard the fire was to guard one another, and this intimacy of flame and flesh extended beyond necessity. Once fire became reliable, it became sacred. Each hearth a small cosmos, its centre glowing with life, its edge dissolving into darkness. When embers flared, they seemed to breathe. When sparks rose, they mimicked the stars. Fire connected the immediate and the infinite, a bridge between human fragility and the vast indifferent night. It is no wonder that nearly every human culture, even tens of thousands of years later, would imagine fire as divine, as a gift stolen from the gods or born from the bones of the earth. Because before there were gods, there was awe, and awe began with the discovery that a creature could summon light from darkness. But fire was more than symbol. It was power, dominion, the first true technology that did not simply use nature, but transformed it. What happens when a species learns not just to adapt to the world, but to alter it? Fire was the first tool that didn't cut, crush, or pierce, but changed the very state of matter. It cooked, softened, hardened, purified. It extended the boundaries of what was edible, what was workable, what was survivable, and in doing so, it rewrote the rules of life. Food became easier to digest, unlocking calories once trapped in raw fiber and sinew. This shift reshaped not only survival, but biology. Over time, our jaws shrank, our guts shortened, our brains expanded. Cooking wasn't just convenience, it was evolution. The hearth became humanity's first forge. Even before metal, it prepared the way. Heat cracked stone in useful ways. It dried sinew for bowstrings, cured hides for clothing, smoked meat for storage. It baked clay into shape. It made forests yield more fruit by clearing underbrush. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was strategy, precision. An ancient form of engineering, practiced without blueprints, but with an exquisite intimacy with cause and effect. This dominion over nature born from fire set us apart. Not above other species, for that is a modern conceit, but apart. Different. Fire gave humans a kind of power no other animal possessed. The power to change ecosystems without leaving footprints. A patch of savanna once burned, returned greener. A valley, once cleared, fed more mouths. Entire landscapes were shaped not by machines but by torches. And yet, for all its utility, fire remained a mystery. Even those who mastered it must have sensed its wildness. Fire could be summoned, but never owned. It consumed as it gave. It destroyed as it protected. It danced and hissed and leapt without warning. And in its flicker, early humans saw something that mirrored their own new inner world. Unpredictable, radiant, hungry for more. In the hush of ancient nights, that mystery became metaphor. Fire became the soul, the breath, the voice. Across cultures and epochs, it would later come to symbolize knowledge, purity, wrath, renewal. But even before the first myth, fire was felt as something more than physical. Its light made visible the invisible, the expressions on a loved one's face, the gleam of tools, the shimmer of eyes in the dark. Fire illuminated not just space but relationship, and as language formed, tentative, musical, layered with gesture, fire was there. It may be that our first stories were told not just beside fire, but because of it, that its rhythms and unpredictability trained the brain to follow patterns, to anticipate, to imagine. Watching flames is still, to this day, hypnotic. It draws the eye, calms the body, opens the mind. Perhaps because long ago it was a teacher, a partner, a muse. Fire taught us that something could be kept alive through care. That knowledge could be passed down not in genes but in practice. That time could be stretched. That night could be survived. And as these lessons crystallized, the lines between survival, technology, and meaning began to blur. Fire was no longer just a tool, it was a language of transformation. And like all language, it shaped not only what we could do, but how we could think. Around the hearth, thought took on new forms. The mind could dwell in stories, not just strategies. The present moment, once all-consuming, now shared space with memory and imagination. With fire came the evening, not just as an extension of daylight, but as a new kind of time, reflective time, social time, time in which the individual became the collective. In this deepening of mind, something else was born. Culture. Not culture as cities or music or books, but culture as the transmission of learned behaviour, the inheritance of ways of being. When fire was passed from hand to hand, it was more than a glowing stick. It was a symbol of continuity, of what one generation gives to the next, of knowledge that cannot be seen but must be shown. And with this passing came roles. Some gathered the wood, others fed the flames, someone watched, someone told the stories. Even in small bands, fire structured society. It created a centre, and from that centre, hierarchy could emerge. Not dominance, not yet, but distinction. Memory keepers, fire tenders, those who knew where to find dry kindling even in the wet season. These were early experts, early teachers, the first stirrings of leadership. But perhaps more important than who spoke was what could now be said. The fire circle allowed for repetition, for the same story to be told again, altered slightly, remembered, reshaped. This was how oral traditions began, not as entertainment, but as storage. Fire turned memory into architecture, every story a shelter, every myth a container. Here, language and flame intertwined. Words shaped the fire's meaning, and the fire gave space for words to evolve. When someone pointed toward the dark and named what might be waiting, whether predator or spirit, it wasn't just communication. It was a story, a possibility, a caution, the earliest seeds of belief. And belief, once born, grew strong beside the coals. When thunder cracked or an eclipse swallowed the moon, where else but the fire could meaning be sought? It was the only consistent presence in a world of unknowns. Fire became the first shrine, not to gods, but to memory, to the need to make sense of the world. And when someone died, as they often did, too soon, in the rawness of that age, it was to fire that the tribe returned, to tell the stories, to sit in silence, in time perhaps to offer the body itself to flame. Cremation may have begun not as ritual, but as necessity. Yet even necessity becomes sacred when repeated. Fire became not only a symbol of life, but of death, a portal, a purifier, a companion through endings. Thus fire bridged more than night and day. It bridged life and afterlife, the seen and the unseen. And in that space, language flourished, meaning took root. The human soul began to stretch toward mystery, and mystery, once glimpsed, never quite lets go. Around the fire, the world was no longer just what it was. It became what it might mean. A glowing coal became a heart, a crackling log, a voice, a spiral of smoke, a spirit leaving. Fire became metaphor, even before the word for metaphor existed. The physical world was still the only world, but it was thickened with significance. And so, even when humans began to carry fire beyond the hearth, into torches, into signal beacons, into travelling embers hidden in bark, they were not just transporting heat, they were transporting meaning. Fire became the visible trace of human presence, a mark left on the world, just as caves would later hold handprints and ochre lines. Wherever fire burned, it said, someone was here, someone watched, someone remembered. That symbolism deepened as our ancestors spread across continents. Fire cleared land, but also sanctified it. Campsites became sacred sites. Burned earth became storied earth. And over time, fire began to reflect the growing complexity of the societies it served. It was used to shape tools, cure glues, protect settlements. It was given names. It was guarded in temples. In some cultures, only certain people could tend it. In others, it was the heart of law and prophecy. Yet even as fire became more controlled, it remained untamed. A reminder that the forces we harness are never truly ours. And perhaps that's why fire has remained, across millennia, a symbol not only of power, but of humility. To sit before a flame is to witness something older than language, older than gods, older than names, something that does not need to be believed in to be real. Even today, fire draws us together, campfires, candles, stoves, screens. The flicker remains. We still gather around light in the dark, still seek warmth in each other's presence, still speak more softly when shadows move across the walls. And though we have forgotten the time when fire had to be begged from stone or stolen from lightning, we remember it in our metaphors. We still say, spark of an idea. We still feel burning curiosity. We still speak of people who have a fire inside, because we do. That fire is not literal, not anymore, but it is ancient. It is the trace of a time when warmth had to be earned, when night was full of teeth, and when the only hope for safety, for connection, for meaning, was found in the glow of something we could barely control yet could not live without. Fire made us human, not through its flames, but through what it allowed us to become beside them. And as the last coals fade in the mind's eye, we carry that warmth forward, into story, into silence, into the long unfolding of thought. The language of fire still speaks, in every word, in every gathering, in every dream that rises glowing from the dark. The first tool was not a masterpiece. It was a broken edge. A flake, perhaps the size of a thumb, struck from a larger stone with no more than instinct and intent. But in that fracture, in that sudden release of potential from within stone, something irrevocable happened. The human story turned a corner, not with words, not with fire, but with the sound of a rock striking another, and the mind behind it noticing what could be done. What do we leave behind when we are gone? Bones vanish, wood rots, words, unspoken, are air. But stone remains, and in that silence stone becomes the record, the tool, the witness, the scar. Archaeology, at its heart, is a listening to this long silence, a reading of the marks left behind not by design, but by pressure, by practice, by need. The earliest stone tools, and the Oldowan flakes named after the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania where they were first unearthed, were not ornamental. They were brutal, functional, edges that could cut flesh from bone, or crack open marrow-rich shafts, or strip bark. They were the difference between surviving and not. But is there something more hidden in their form? They are small, yes, and simple. But in their angles and refittings there is foresight. Some flakes show signs of having been struck from core stones carried long distances. Some were resharpened, some discarded only when worn to nothing. This is not random. This is memory. This is planning. A brain no longer tied to the moment, but reaching ahead and behind. A mind beginning to shape the future by shaping matter. Soon, the flakes gave way to something more ambitious. The Eculian hand axe, a teardrop shaped bifacially worked stone, appears in the archaeological record almost 1.5 million years ago. Unlike the Oldowan tools, these were symmetrical, balanced. Their design, spanning continents and hundreds of thousands of years, is uncannily consistent, which raises a haunting question. Was this shape taught or remembered? Is this the first example of standardization, of tradition? To hold one of these axes, to feel the edge where skin once split, to weigh the balance designed for a palm-long dust, is to feel a kind of eerie closeness. The person who made it had no city, no script, no gods, but they had the same hands, the same opposable thumbs, the same slow inhale before the final strike of stone on stone. In this way, the hand axe becomes not only a tool, but a mirror. What does it mean that the earliest artifacts we possess are not paintings or words, but weapons? And yet, were they only weapons? The same edge that can kill can carve. The same point that can puncture can shape wood, or scrape hides, or create other tools. These early instruments were not simple. They were polyvalent, extending the body into new domains. They changed what a human could touch, could change, could transform. What happens when your hands learn to reach beyond themselves? And what happens when those hands, now armed, turn on each other? For a long time, we imagined prehistory as a kind of innocence, a long peace before civilization's violence. But the stones tell a different story. They do not lie, though they never speak. Some carry not only the marks of making, but of unmaking, fractures from impact not against bone or wood, but against other stone tools. Some are found alongside skeletons with cracked skulls, shattered ribs, or weapon-shaped wounds. The line between tool and weapon was never clean. Perhaps it never can be. At sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, 13,000 years old, archaeologists have uncovered human remains pierced by stone points, lodged still in ribs and vertebrae as if time itself refused to remove them. Dozens of individuals buried together, their injuries deliberate, the earliest evidence perhaps of organised violence, but also of grief. The graves carefully dug, the bodies placed side by side. Violence, even then, did not erase tenderness. It called it forth. To read these traces is to see the paradox of humanity's rise. Every tool that allows us to create also allows us to destroy. Every act of shaping matter is also a negotiation with mortality. Stone tools were not only technologies of survival, they were extensions of will. They gave form to intent, and intent, for the first time, could wound. Yet alongside these scars, we find something else, signs of cooperation. Sites where tools were made in clusters, where one person's flakes complement another's cause, where the pattern of debris suggests not solitary labour but shared rhythm. The making of stone tools was noisy, rhythmic, patterned, almost musical. One can imagine the sound echoing through the ancient air. Click, crack, flake, pause, teaching through repetition, learning through imitation, a chorus of cognition, each strike an act of communication. This cooperation reveals more than practical necessity. It reveals an early form of social order, the unspoken choreography of who works, who watches, who learns. Even without language, humans were learning to coordinate, to synchronize, to pass down not just tools but techniques, an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching across generations, and in that chain, the first social structures took shape. Elders and apprentices, makers and gatherers, roles and rules, invisible but binding. Still, violence and cooperation are twins. The same hands that strike stone with precision can strike flesh with the same motion. The same coordination that teaches can also plan a hunt, an ambush, a defense. To hold a tool is to hold potential, for creation or for harm. Archaeology cannot always tell which occurred. A flint point near a bone might be evidence of butchery or battle, but the distinction perhaps is less important than what it reveals: intention. For a creature to leave a wound, in matter, in meat, in memory, and to understand what it has done, is to cross a threshold no animal had crossed before. The stone and the scar are two sides of the same inheritance, and as the stones multiplied, so too did the stories they carried. What happens when we begin to read those stories, when archaeology becomes not science alone, but empathy? It becomes a kind of time travel, a quiet, reverent pursuit, not to resurrect the past, but to feel its pressure, like a fingerprint pressed into earth long hardened. Each shard, each flake, each worn groove in a hammerstone becomes a sentence in an unfinished narrative. But it is not fiction. These are not symbols. They are traces of real decisions made by real hands, in real landscapes with real consequences. And through them, we glimpse not just the behaviours of early humans, but their values, their fears, their bonds. In the stone-strewn campsites of ancient riverbeds and open plains, patterns emerge. A cluster of tools around what was once a hearth, bones arranged not by accident, but with deliberation, waste discarded far from where food was shared. These are the echoes of structure, of thought, of communities negotiating space and safety and significance. Some sites show evidence of care beyond mere efficiency. Healed fractures and skeletons suggest that injured individuals were tended to over time. They could not have survived alone. Someone brought them food, someone waited. These are the quiet signs of compassion, harder to measure than a hand axe, but more profound. The archaeological record is not only a ledger of death and survival, it is a ledger of relationship, and when tools are found buried with the dead, a flake tucked beside a child, a hand axe laid across a chest, they take on yet another layer of meaning. No longer just practical, they become symbolic. Gifts, offerings, tokens of memory or belief, or continuity. The scar of loss softened by ritual. In these moments, prehistory flickers with something recognizable: grief. This is the bridge archaeology builds, not between now and then, but between self and other. When we read the record as more than data, when we imagine the life behind the object, we begin to feel the texture of minds long extinguished. A broken blade becomes a moment of frustration. A reworked flake, a sign of perseverance. A cache of tools hidden in a crevice, a gesture of planning. We begin to see not just evolution, but emotion. This is what makes archaeology an act of storytelling. Forensic, yes, but also poetic. The methods are rigorous, the interpretations careful. But within that precision is a yearning to understand, not to judge or to romanticize, but to witness. To let the past be as complex as the present, to grant the same dignity to those who knapped stone in the dust as we do to those who build cities now. Because in the end, the past is not another world. It is the foundation of this one, and the people who shaped it, chipped it, cut it, carried it, are not so distant. They live in us, in our tools, in our rituals, in the scars we leave behind. And if every tool is a question, then what were they asking, those ancient makers? What were they trying to shape? Out of stone, out of life, out of time? Perhaps they weren't seeking permanence but immediacy, not legacy, but utility. The Acheulean maker napping a hand axe by the river was not thinking of us, not imagining a museum or a lecture hall. They were preparing to skin a carcass, or split a tuber, or protect a child. Their motivations were urgent, intimate, and grounded in need. And yet, through that need, they carved meaning into geology. They transformed rock into narrative. And the rock remembers. In every excavation site, archaeologists trace the silent choreography of extinct gestures. The sweep of a wrist, the angle of a strike, the knowledge of which stone fractures predictably and which resists the blow. This is not instinct. It is skill. Learned, practiced, corrected, passed down. The hands that shaped these tools were not improvising. They were following a tradition, invisible, but deeply embedded. Even when the tools themselves evolved, the logic behind them remained. Consider the Levallois technique, a refined method that emerged later, with Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. Here, the toolmaker pre-shaped a core to produce flakes of desired shape and size. It was not just breaking stone, it was architectural thinking, planning several steps ahead, holding a blueprint in the mind, invisible but precise. This is abstraction, this is foresight, this is a brain not only reacting to the world, but redesigning its possibilities, and yet the tools were not just extensions of thought, they were extensions of the body. The blade was a new finger, the scraper, a new nail, each one an attempt to overcome the natural limits of human flesh, to bite deeper, reach farther, endure longer, to be more than we were born to be. The stone made the human body elastic, and once it began, there was no going back. But these tools did more than change our capacity to act. They changed how we perceived the world. A landscape once seen as neutral became strategic. This hill has good flint. That river yields prey. This cave provides shelter from wind and bears. The environment was no longer a setting. It was a map, a resource, a puzzle to solve. And with every stone struck, humans etched themselves more deeply into that map. We were not just walking across the earth. We were altering it, one flake at a time. The archaeological record preserves this transformation not just in artifacts but in absences. A missing layer of soil, a sudden gap in the pollen record, burned ground, extinct species. The impact of stone tools echoes beyond their shape. It reshaped ecosystems. Even before farming, even before cities, we were a geological force. The Anthropocene did not begin with the steam engine. Its earliest whispers lie in butchered bones and vanished megafauna. This is what the scar tells us. Not only that we were here, but that we changed what here meant. That our tools reached further than we realized. That our intelligence left traces not just in skull size, but in broken stones and broken patterns. And yet, despite all this change, something still flickered beneath. A longing, perhaps, for connection, for remembrance, for meaning beyond survival. That is where the scar becomes something more than a wound. It becomes a story. Not one spoken aloud, not yet, but one carried in the hand, in the repetition of a learned strike, in the choice to shape a world instead of merely endure it. Every chipped flint is a sentence in a language without grammar. Every hearth ringed by discarded cores is a page in a book the earth has been writing since before we had names. And the readers of this book, the archaeologists, the storytellers, the seekers, must learn to listen with care, because the voices they follow are faint. They do not shout. They are buried beneath time, beneath sediment, beneath our assumptions. But when uncovered, they speak with startling clarity. They say, we were not simple, we were not brute, we were makers, we were thinkers, we were afraid, we hoped, and perhaps above all we remembered. The act of crafting a tool is an act of anticipation. It imagines a future where the tool will be needed. It holds space for a problem not yet encountered. This is the root of narrative, to prepare for what has not yet happened, to shape the world in advance of its unfolding. In this way, the stone tool becomes the ancestor of the myth, the ritual, the plan. It is the first sign that the human mind was reaching forward, but it also looked back. The patterns in toolmaking were passed down. Slowly, yes, clumsily perhaps, but with enough fidelity that across vast spaces and times we see recurring forms. The same curve of a scraper, the same bevel of a point. These were not accidents. They were inheritances, not through genes, but through gestures, through the sharing of attention, through the alignment of intention. This is how culture begins, in the moment when one human pauses to show another how a thing is done, and the other remembers. That pause, that space between one person's knowledge and another's learning, stem, is sacred. It is where time bends, where continuity begins, and where we, as a species, stepped out of nature's cycle and into our own story. The tools are long buried, the bones are dust, but the gestures remain. In our hands, our cities, our languages, in every object we shape, in every system we design, in every structure we build. The echo of that first flake cracked from stone, the echo of intention, of imagination, of change. The scar, then, is not only a mark of violence, it is a record of growth, of adaptation, of becoming. We are the species that leaves scars as on stone, on landscape, on each other, but we are also the species that reads them, that wonders at them, that learns from them. And so, the broken tools beneath our feet are not just the remnants of an ancient world, they are beginnings, the first lines in a story we are still telling. A story carved in stone and still unfolding in flesh. Beneath our cities, beneath the forests, beneath the cracked floors of dry riverbeds and the dust-heavy ceilings of ancient caves, there are bones, not just fragments of biology, not just what remains when flesh forgets how to hold itself together, but echoes. Some lie curled in fetal position, facing east toward imagined dawns. Others are lined with ochre, red as blood once was. Still others hold shells, beads, or tools in their embrace, objects that served no use in death, unless death itself had become something more than absence. What happens when death becomes meaning? The earliest graves do not shout. They whisper. They murmur from dirt and stone and silence, suggesting that long before the first temple was raised, before the first god was named, we looked into the eyes of the lifeless and saw more than loss. We saw a question, a presence that lingered, even as breath did not. Somewhere in the shadows of the Middle Paleolithic, perhaps 100,000 years ago, the Neanderthals did something new. They buried their dead, and in that act the world changed. But why bury when the world was still so young, so dangerous, so consumed with the urgency of survival? Why divert strength to dig and to grieve, to cover and to mark? One possibility is hygiene, another is predator control. But those are not the stories the bones tell. The careful placement, the recurring directionality, the red ochre and flower pollen. These are not acts of utility. They are gestures. They are poems. They are perhaps prayers. In the Shanidar cave in Iraq, archaeologists found the remains of a Neanderthal surrounded by ancient pollen clusters, as if wildflowers had been laid upon the body in farewell. For decades, some questioned whether the pollen had simply blown in. But even that debate reveals something deeper, a longing, even in science, to believe that those ancient hands were not just strong but tender, that before there was writing, there was ritual, that before there was theology, there was remembrance. To remember someone is to defy their disappearance. The act of burial carves a line between the living and the dead. It says, this one was, this one mattered, this one belongs to us, even now. And through that line, something astonishing begins to unfold. The emergence of culture not as a byproduct of tools but of loss. The grave becomes the first archive, not of records, but of relationships. It is not what we can learn from the dead that first shaped us. It is what we could not bear to forget. And so we gathered bones not to discard them, but to guard them. We shaped the earth around them. We bent time into memory. But what did they believe they were preserving? Was it the soul, the name, or simply the outline of a presence too heavy to release? And how do you build a culture around what is no longer there? Perhaps you begin with the objects left behind. In many early burials, nestled beside the bodies, are stone tools, pieces of ochre, animal bones, beads carved from ivory or shell. None of these served a purpose for the dead, but they served a purpose for the living, the purpose of saying something wordless, of marking a boundary between the ordinary and the sacred. These objects, now called grave goods, are among our oldest evidence of spirituality, of belief not just in death, but in something after. And even if there was no after, even if these early humans did not imagine heavens or underworlds, they imagined continuity, a thread between life and death that could be maintained. In this thread, the object becomes a symbol, not for what it is, but for what it means. The hand axe beside the body says, "You are a hunter." The shell pressed into the palm says, "You are cherished." The red ochre brushed along the ribs says, "You return to the earth in beauty." These acts are not pragmatic, they are expressive. They are, in the truest sense, artistic. From the Chauvet cave paintings to burial mounds in Sungir, Russia, where children were buried with thousands of painstakingly drilled ivory beads, we see evidence that death was not merely a biological event. It was a social rupture. It was responded to not with silence, but with creativity. The living used ritual to shape their grief, to make sense of it, to give it rhythm so it wouldn't break them, and with rhythm comes repetition. What is ritual, after all, but the repetition of meaning? A way of walking through the dark with something to hold. In Paleolithic societies, death rituals likely varied widely. Some may have burned bodies, some left them exposed, some carried bones as keepsakes. But across time and terrain, one truth remains. The dead were not ignored. They were engaged. Their presence was acknowledged, not erased. In this way, early spirituality may not have begun with gods, but with ghosts. Not the cinematic kind, not malicious spirits or monsters, but the quiet sense that those we love do not simply vanish, that they linger, in place, in memory, in pattern, that perhaps the sound in the wind, or the crack in the fire, or the shape of a shadow is not random. It is them, or something of them, watching, waiting, witnessing. And so our ancestors developed not just graves, but geographies of mourning, sacred sites, ancestral places, locations returned to again and again, not for shelter, but for story. The presence of bones transformed land into legacy. Death made memory physical. It anchored the intangible to the tangible, the soul to the soil. That is how a world without writing began to write itself. Not in ink, but in placement, in gesture, in what was chosen to be left behind, and in what was chosen to be kept. Not all bones were buried. Some were worn, carried, displayed. In certain early cultures, human teeth were strung as pendants. Skulls were decorated or placed in prominent locations. Long bones were shaped into tools or instruments. These acts may seem macabre to us now, but they were likely saturated with reverence, not desecration, but devotion. A desire not to forget, a way to hold on, literally, to those who had passed. What do you do with grief, when there are no poems to recite, no scriptures to read, no gravestones to visit? You make meaning with your hands. You return again and again to the place where they died. You whisper over their remains, hoping the wind carries the message. You rearrange the world in such a way that it never quite lets them go. And this is where we begin to see the first glimpses of what might one day become religion, or perhaps something even older, presence work. Spirituality as felt continuity, a sense that the boundary between the living and the dead is not impermeable, that relationships can extend beyond breath, that what you do now in this world still matters to the ones who have gone, and maybe they still matter to you. Grave goods are not offerings to a god, they are messages to the dead, and messages require belief that the other side can receive them. This belief doesn't necessarily mean a vision of heaven or a defined afterlife. It might not mean belief in any supernatural force at all, but it suggests that for early humans, consciousness didn't simply vanish. It echoed, it left a trace, and that trace demanded attention, demanded ritual, demanded response. It's tempting to imagine that this awareness of death arose only with Homo sapiens. But the evidence complicates that story. Neanderthals buried their dead with care. Denisovans may have too. We don't yet know. Even Homo naledi, a far earlier hominin with a much smaller brain, may have intentionally placed their dead in deep cave systems. If true, that finding would shatter long-held assumptions about the link between brain size and symbolic thought. But perhaps the real question isn't when ritual began, it's why. Why did early humans start treating the dead differently than animals do? Elephants grieve, chimpanzees mourn, but only humans bury, decorate, return, remember. Only humans build structure around absence. Only humans turn loss into legacy. And in that turning, something vital occurs. We step outside the immediacy of time. To bury someone is to believe in a future in which their body still matters, in which someone, maybe you, maybe your kin, will come back, will recall, will speak of the one who is gone. Burial is memory projected forward, and in that projection we begin to glimpse history. Not history as record, but as longing, as connection across time, as the insistence that no one should vanish without trace, even if all we have is soil and silence and stone. That's where the first human histories were written, not in ink, but in earth. Not with dates or names, but with arrangements, patterns. The curve of a body placed with care, the bead laid beneath a child's head, the ochre brushed across a femur. These were not accidental. They were records of feeling, records of presence, and more than that, they were declarations that this life mattered enough to be marked. To mark something is to resist forgetting. And in a world without calendars, without ledgers, without script, the grave became the only page available, and so they wrote, with hands, with stones, with flowers, with time. The Sungya site in Russia holds two of the most haunting Paleolithic burials ever found. A boy and girl, perhaps 9 and 13 years old, were interred head to head, clad in garments adorned with thousands of mammoth ivory beads. These beads would have taken hundreds of hours to craft. The devotion is staggering. In a world where survival was daily labour, this kind of effort, this abundance offered to the dead, is not just sentimental, it is civilizational. It is evidence of love, of grief, of value. It also hints at hierarchy. Not every person was buried with such opulence. Some were laid in shallow pits with few goods or none. The disparity suggests early ideas of status, of difference. Death did not erase identity, it preserved it. Whatever roles these children held in life, their burial ensured those roles would echo far beyond it. This too is part of the story, the way death ritual begins to mirror social structure. The dead are not just mourned, they are remembered in ways that reinforce the world of the living. Ancestors become symbols, lineages begin. Power perhaps finds its roots not just in strength, but in who is buried where and with what. It's a quiet transformation, but profound. Because as soon as graves are shaped by more than grief, as soon as they become political, symbolic, sacred, we are entering the early architecture of belief. Not just spirituality, but worldview, a sense of cosmic order, a sense that life and death are not random, but part of a larger pattern. And in that pattern, death becomes not just the end of a body, but the beginning of a story. The bones beneath us are not inert. They are active participants in how we think, how we organize, how we relate. They tell us that death did not silence the individual, it amplified them. It made their absence speak louder than their presence ever could. The body decayed, but the place remained, and in that place people returned, sat, remembered, grieved again, told stories, sang songs, lit fires. In this way, the grave became the first temple, not because it housed a god, but because it held something sacred, memory, and where memory is held, culture begins to crystallize. Over time, these burial places, these quiet cradles of bone and earth, became the anchors of identity. They tethered communities to landscapes not just for resources but for meaning. A valley was not just a hunting ground, it was where the old ones rested. A cave was not just a shelter, it was where the voices of the dead echoed in the drip of water and the rustle of wind. Burial transformed wilderness into home, and with home comes continuity. When people bury their dead, they tend to stay nearby, or return, again and again. In doing so, they begin to shape not just memory but territory, not in the colonial sense, not with borders and flags, but in the emotional sense, in the sacred sense. Land becomes storied, a place becomes a lineage, a path becomes a pilgrimage. The bones beneath us are not just remnants, they are roots, and those roots deepen through time, through climate shifts, through migration and fire and flood. In places like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, we find elaborate burials amid mammoth bone dwellings. In Kafsa Cave in Israel, a child lies buried with a deer antler held to its chest. These are not coincidences. They are expressions of care and continuity, and something we might call soul. We must be careful, though, not to project our own beliefs onto these people. We cannot know what exactly they thought about death, but we do know they thought about it. They responded to it. They shaped their lives in its presence, and in that shaping something distinctly human emerges, the refusal to let go without meaning. Even today, our relationship with death is shaped by these ancient patterns. We bury, we honour, we gather, we carry tokens, we speak names, we light candles. The rituals vary, but the impulse is the same, to transform loss into memory, to make something endure, because we are a species that remembers, and in that remembrance we create bonds across time. The dead are not gone, they are woven into us, in our stories, in our gestures, in the quiet pauses we leave between words. The past is not past, it is under our feet, it is in our hands, it is the breath behind our language, the ache behind our art. The bones beneath us are not relics, they are relatives. Each skull, each rib, each cradle of ancient vertebrae is a message sent forward, not in words, but in presence. A reminder that this too is part of being human, to lose, to love, to lay to rest, and to remember. And when we stand in a field, or enter a cave, or feel that hush in an old stone place, we are not alone. We are among kin, among witnesses. Among the first poets, who spoke not in song, but in silence, and in stone. The dead are not gone. They are listening, and perhaps, even now, they are still waiting to be heard. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the reach of sunlight, a hand touched stone. It left behind a red smear, shaped like a halo, a negative space where flesh met limestone. A horse followed, then bison, lions, running lines of ochre and charcoal and manganese black. And in this stillness, deeper than any grave, older than any village, art began to whisper. What is a dream, if not memory turned inward? And what is a painting, if not a dream laid bare? The walls of Chauvet Cave in southern France hold a world unseen. Not just animals, but movement, the gallop of hooves, the lunge of a predator, the curve of horns caught in moonlight. These images were not scratched hastily, they were composed, measured. They were placed to breathe with the contours of the rock. The artist knew that light from a flickering flame would make their creatures ripple with motion. This was not idle decoration. This was performance. It was invocation. Yet Chauvet is not alone. Across the globe, in the caves of Sulawesi in Indonesia, hand stencils and animal forms speak from tens of thousands of years ago. A warty pig, a pair of deer, and everywhere, hands, reaching, pressing, vanishing, as if to say, I was here, as if to beg, remember me. How did we come to this? When did pigment become language? When did a smear of ochre become a sacred act? These were not random gestures. They required preparation, tools, light, vision. The artist travelled deep into winding caverns, sometimes crawling, often climbing. They carried animal fat lamps and hollow bones to blow pigment. They mixed their colours with spit, with marrow, with the ashes of burnt wood. To paint in a place without light is not just difficult. It is symbolic. It is a descent, a rite. So why paint where no one can see? Perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps the point was not for many to see, but for the chosen few to enter. Perhaps the audience was not human at all. Perhaps the walls were sacred. Perhaps the act of painting was not communication, but communion. What did they see in the darkness? What stirred in the silence? The answer may lie in the mind itself. Neurologists studying altered states, trance, dreaming, deep meditation, have found that visual hallucinations often begin with dots, grids, spirals, tunnels. These shapes appear not only in prehistoric cave art but also in the earliest textiles, sculptures and carvings. The connection is not accidental. It suggests something startling, that the first artists may have been drawing what they saw not outside but within. That art was not just a mirror of the world, but a map of consciousness itself. But consciousness is not content with patterns. It wants meaning. It wants story. So what happens when the dreaming brain picks up a piece of charcoal, leans into stone and starts to tell a tale? Something unprecedented. Something utterly human. The moment pigment touches stone with intent, not just to mark but to represent, we cross a threshold. We enter the realm of symbolic cognition. These weren't just pictures. They were signs. They were metaphors. They were the first attempts to speak across silence, to trap time in an image. In the deep chambers of El Castillo cave in Spain, red discs and hand stencils have been dated to over 40,000 years ago. Some may even predate Homo sapiens in Europe, suggesting that Neanderthals too might have engaged in this profound act of symbolic marking. If true, it would not only rewrite the story of art, it would widen the circle of humanity's dreaming mind. These early images don't merely reflect the animals they depict, they capture essence. A horse is not just a horse. It is a spirit, a movement, a memory of the hunt, a prayer for abundance, or perhaps a myth told beside firelight. The artists exaggerated features, layered bodies in motion, and used the natural undulations of the rock to give life to stillness. These were not literal renderings. They were stylized, abstracted, evocative. The abstraction is key. It marks a shift in cognition, from simple imitation to imaginative transformation. The ability to see not just what is, but what could be. This leap is not technological, but psychological. It means the artist could hold in their mind an image of something not physically present, and summon it into being through gesture, through mark-making. And in doing so, they created more than art. They created memory. Because what is art, if not the attempt to resist forgetting? To hold on to something too large, too fleeting, too sacred to name? Whether it was the thrill of the chase, the grace of the antelope, the terror of the lion, or the mystery of the stars, these images became vessels. They were dreamed into stone so that others, generations later, might feel what they felt. And this act of transmission, across time, across minds, is what makes art different from instinct. Birds build nests, beavers build dams, but only humans make meaning. Only humans walk into a cave and paint a bison in the dark. And this capacity didn't arise overnight. It was seeded in the long evolution of the brain, in the expansion of the prefrontal cortex, the refinement of motor control, the development of mirror neurons and memory systems. It bloomed in social groups where stories could be told, gestures shared, and symbols passed down like sacred fire. It is in this interplay between brain and hand, pigment and stone, dream and memory, that the first art was born, and once born, it never truly died. Even as the caves fell silent and their entrances sealed with time, the impulse remained, the impulse to record, to remember, to reimagine. The walls of Chauvet, Altamira, Sulawesi and Lascaux are not relics of a lost art, but echoes of a living one, a lineage stretching unbroken through time from torchlight to firelight to screenlight. But why did they do it? What compelled these ancient humans, and perhaps their Neanderthal cousins, to journey deep into the earth, carrying pigments, flames, and visions? The answer, if it can be found at all, lies in the shifting space between function and feeling. Some scholars propose that the art was practical, hunting magic perhaps, where animals were drawn to ensure their capture. Others see the work as spiritual, shamanic, visions born of trance states, induced by rhythmic movement, isolation, and flickering light. Still others interpret the imagery as early storytelling, myths rendered in pigment, not word. And perhaps all of these are true. Perhaps the cave was a place where everything bled together. Memory and magic, story and survival, sound and silence. These spaces were acoustically resonant. Many of the chambers where paintings are found also respond richly to voice, to drumming, to song. The walls themselves sing, and it is tempting to imagine that rituals took place here. Dances, chants, the stamping of feet on rock. That art was not passive, but performed. That these caves were not just galleries, they were theatres. The animal figures, so dynamic, so vital, are often clustered in ways that suggest narrative. A group of horses gallop toward a ledge. Lions chase bison. Mammoths loom over the viewer, their massive outlines stretching with the stone. These are not random. They are scenes, perhaps stories, perhaps prayers. And then there are the handprints, always the handprints, dozens of them, in every continent where cave art has been found, sometimes painted in outline by blowing pigment over the hand, sometimes filled in solid, sometimes repeated, as if reaching again and again into the dark. The handprint is not just a signature, it is an echo of presence, a human moment caught like a breath in still air. It says simply, I was here, but perhaps it also says, we are here. Because in these caves the individual dissolves into the collective, the painter is unknown, the stories are shared, the dream belongs to all. This is what makes cave art so haunting and so powerful. It is anonymous and yet deeply personal. It is rooted in survival, and yet it yearns towards something higher. It is silent, and yet it speaks, and what it tells us is that the human mind was dreaming long before it was writing. Writing would come tens of thousands of years later, born from trade, from record-keeping, from the need to count and control. But art came from wonder. It was not an answer to necessity, but a conversation with mystery. It did not begin in daylight, but in darkness. Not in cities, but in caves. Not as instruction, but as reverence. Imagine the flicker of torchlight on the uneven wall, the red and black pigments shimmering as the flame swayed. The animals seemed to move, to run, to breathe, to emerge. The painters crouched in that living glow were not simply representing the world, they were summoning it. The cave was not just a space, it was an event, a threshold, the membrane between what is seen and what is sensed. And through that membrane came the first art of the unseen, of abstraction, of symbol. Lines and dots, spirals and lattices, handprints and crosshatches. These motifs appear across continents and ages, carved into bone, scratched into rock, painted with ochre. They are universal, and perhaps they arose from a universal source, the architecture of the human brain itself. When the eye is deprived of light, when the mind enters trance or dream, certain neural patterns manifest as visions, grids, spirals, tunnels of light. These are not cultural, they are biological, and they appear again and again in ancient art. The cave wall became the first canvas for the human interior, the mind projected outward. What began as sensation became story, what began as vision became belief. But belief in what? Some see these paintings as early forms of spiritual practice, attempts to commune with forces larger than the self. In the shamanic interpretation, the artist was not merely painting animals, but embodying them, entering their spirit to ensure the balance between hunter and hunted. Others see a more psychological function, art as a way to organize experience, to make sense of chaos. Still others argue for beauty itself, for the sheer ineffable pleasure of creation. Because even then, deep in the Paleolithic dark, there was delight in making. The curve of a mammoth's tusk, the play of light on pigment, the satisfaction of form realized. To make art is to feel alive, to test the boundaries of perception, to leave a mark upon the unyielding world. Perhaps all these meanings coexisted. Perhaps they were never separate to begin with. The sacred and the aesthetic, the practical and the ecstatic, all interwoven. In the cave, no line divided survival from spirit. To depict an animal was to understand it, to honour it, to participate in its mystery. And in that participation, something extraordinary occurred. The world ceased to be merely external. It became relational, animated, alive. In painting the horse, they were not copying it. They were conversing with it. This was the first language, not of words but of images, not bound by syntax but carried by rhythm, by symbol, by shared gaze. And perhaps it was this, more than tools or fire or burial that defined us. The capacity not only to see, but to re-see, to take the world as it is, and reshape it with the inner eye. Long before agriculture, long before cities, we had already begun the slow weaving of culture. Each painted line, each handprint, each smear of ochre was a thread, and together they formed the first tapestry of human imagination. A net cast into the darkness, hoping to catch something beyond the now, something eternal. And we did. Because when we look at these images today, 30,000 or 40,000 years later, we still understand. We may not know the exact stories or the precise intentions, but we feel them. We recognize the yearning, the grace, the awe. We recognize ourselves. In the darkness of Chauvet or Lascaux or Sulawesi, we are no longer separate from those who came before. We become part of the same gesture, the same question. What does it mean to be alive, to witness beauty, to leave a mark before we vanish? The caves do not answer. They never did. But they hold the question gently, like fire cupped in a hand, and maybe that is enough. For in that quiet, stone-bound world, painted by trembling hands in flickering light, we find the roots of what would one day become myth, religion, language, and art. We find the first dreams shared, the first metaphors made flesh, the first attempt to say, this is what it felt like, this is what we saw, this is who we were. And when we walk away, from the cave, from the page, from the past, something follows us. A whisper, a shadow, a shape caught in the corner of the eye. It is not a horse, or a hand, or a lion drawn in charcoal. It is a mirror, and in it, we glimpse not the world as it was, but the world as we began to imagine it, long ago, in the dark, beneath the earth, where dreams learned to speak in pigment. This was not the end of prehistory. It was the beginning of meaning. She's barely 4 inches tall and she has no name, no eyes, no feet. Her face is smooth, featureless, yet her body is full, heavy with curve and fold and form. She is ancient, at least 25,000 years old, and yet she feels present. Not because we know her story, but because we don't. She is the Venus of Willendorf, or Hohlefels, or Dolny Vestonitz. She has many shapes, many names, but all of them begin the same way, in the dark, with a hand pressing stone into symbol. What does it mean to carve the human form before language, before nation, before myth? What does it mean to make a woman before there is a word for woman, before there is history, before there is memory? The figurines we now call Venuses emerged like echoes from the Ice Age. Scattered across Europe and Eurasia, from the limestone caves of France to the cold steppes of Siberia, they appear in stone, in ivory, in fired clay. They are small, small enough to fit in the palm to be carried like secrets. And yet, their presence is monumental. Their breasts are swollen, their hips wide, their thighs full. They are almost never slender, never tall. Most lack faces, many lack feet, but none lack presence. For over a century, scholars have tried to name them: fertility idols, mother goddesses, self-portraits, pornographic tokens, totems of health, symbols of survival, and perhaps they were all of these, or none. Because these figures were not left with instructions, no epigraph, no myth, no story written in stone. Only the form itself, an enduring gesture in 3 dimensions. But we know this. To sculpt a human body is an act of imagination. It is not copying, it is creating. A leap from the real into the symbolic. It means someone saw something sacred in the human shape, particularly in the female shape, and chose to make it last. To take flesh and turn it to form, to make the soft, perishable body into something permanent. But why? Was it hope for a safe birth, a fertile season, a child who would survive the winter? Was it memory of a woman, a mother, a lover, an ancestor now gone? Was it identity, a carving made not of another but of the self? And what does it mean that some of these figures, particularly the Willendorf Venus, lack faces entirely? Was the face too specific, too mortal, too much like looking into a mirror? Or was the face never the point? When we stare at these figurines today, we are not only staring at stone, we are staring into a mind that is reaching outward, reaching toward the body, toward memory, toward the sacred, and above all, toward meaning. What kind of world makes a sculpture before it makes a house? What kind of person carves a woman before carving a god? perhaps one who already understood that life itself was divine. In the Upper Paleolithic world, survival was not guaranteed. Ice gripped the earth. Herds of mammoth and reindeer roamed the tundra, while humans huddled in small bands, hunting, scavenging, gathering. Every winter was a negotiation with death. Every spring was a miracle. In that fragile rhythm, the female body was not just a symbol of reproduction, it was the embodiment of continuity. To create life in such a world was to defy extinction. The Venus figurines might not have been goddesses in the later sense. They were not idols of organised religion. They were instead intimate objects, offerings, talismans, reflections. When archaeologists found them in hearth ash, in burials or tucked into cave crevices, they found them where life was lived and lost. These were not museum pieces. They were companions, held, rubbed, carried, touched until polished smooth by skin. The exaggeration of their forms, the wide hips, the pendulous breasts, the round bellies, speaks to something more than eroticism. They are not portraits of individuals. They are archetypes, life-bearers, givers of nourishment, symbols of endurance. In them the body becomes a landscape, soft hills and flowing curves, a geography of survival itself. Yet perhaps there is something else, something subtler, a whisper that these were not made by men but by women, a mirror turned inward, not outward. In the 1990s, scholar Catherine McCoyd proposed that these figures might be self-representations, what a woman would see if she looked down at her own body while pregnant, carving from memory and perspective rather than observation. From this angle, the Venus of Willendorf is not an object of worship or desire, but an act of self-recognition. Imagine it, a woman seated by the fire, a piece of limestone in her hand, her belly heavy with life, her fingers shaping what she feels more than what she sees, the curve of her own hip, the weight of her own breast, the centre of her own being. It is not vanity, it is testimony. This is what I am. This is what life looks like inside me. In that light, the Venus is no longer passive. She is active. She is author. She is creator of her own form. She carves herself into being. And in doing so, she makes a statement older than language. I exist. This is no small gesture. It is a defiance of impermanence, a refusal to vanish. In a world where life could be extinguished by hunger, cold, or disease, to represent oneself, to claim presence through art, was to rebel against oblivion. And yet, this rebellion was not selfish, it was communal. Because every figure carved, every form shaped, reaffirmed the same truth, that life comes from the body, and the body is sacred. The Venus, then, was both mirror and offering, both self and symbol, both body and cosmos. She was not just the woman who was carved, she was the woman who carved herself. And by carving herself, she carved a space in the world, not just for women, but for meaning. These figurines weren't monuments to power or conquest. They weren't markers of territory or dominance. They didn't speak in the language of kings. They whispered something older, the language of birth, of cycles, of blood, and breath, and bone. So what does it say about Paleolithic society that this was one of its most enduring artistic expressions? It suggests that before hierarchy there was intimacy. Before monuments there were mothers. Before temples there was the hearth, and around it a circle of bodies sharing warmth, food, stories, and time. In this circle, the female body was not marginalised, it was central, not merely as reproductive vessel but as creative force, as myth in motion, and this is important. Because the story we tell about prehistoric gender roles is often a story written backwards, projecting modern assumptions onto ancient lives. But the archaeological record challenges these assumptions. Studies of hunter-gatherer societies, both modern and ancient, suggest a far more egalitarian structure than the rigid gender binaries of later agricultural civilizations. Food was gathered and hunted by all. Tools were shared. Labour was flexible. Survival was communal. Even burial sites show this balance. Grave goods, tools, pigments, ornaments, are not exclusively male or female. There are women buried with hunting weapons and men buried with symbolic objects. There is no universal rule, only a pattern of shared roles, mutual dependence, and a deep reverence for the life-givers. And in this shared structure, the Venus figurines take on a broader meaning. They are not just about fertility in the biological sense. They are about fertility in the symbolic sense, the fertility of culture, the capacity to carry not just children, but stories, memory, identity, art. When a figurine is carved, it is carried. When it is carried, it travels. When it travels, it connects. And here we find another key feature, portability. Unlike cave art, which is rooted in place, the Venus figures are nomadic. They are small enough to be held, hidden, protected. They move with the people, across rivers, across steppes, across generations. In a world without written language, they are scripts of stone, tiny, potent archives of what mattered. Their presence across thousands of kilometres, some found in France, others in Siberia, suggests a shared symbolic vocabulary. Not identical, but resonant, each carved from local material yet echoing a common shape. It's as if different communities were whispering the same idea across time. We see her too, we honour her, she lives in us. This symbolic language, embodied, portable, abstract, may have been the first shared mythology, not of gods, but of humanity, a collective meditation on the body that bears life and the life that shapes culture. And when we imagine these figurines passed from hand to hand, fire to fire, we begin to understand. They were not mere objects. They were messages, not shouted, not proclaimed, but whispered and carried. And like all things carried through time, their meaning changed, even as their shape stayed the same. For modern eyes, raised in a world of text and structure, it is tempting to demand clarity from these artifacts. What was the Venus, a goddess, a charm, a relic of some matriarchal religion lost to time? Yet meaning in the Paleolithic world was not written. It was lived, fluid, layered. Each figurine may have meant something different to the person who carved it, held it, buried it. To some, perhaps it was a prayer. To others, a memory. To others still, a story told in form rather than sound. And in this ambiguity lies their power, because the Venus figurines do something extraordinary. They ask us to sit still, to look, to listen. They invite speculation, yes, but also reflection. They remind us that prehistory is not empty. It is full of moments that mattered deeply to someone, even if we no longer know why. This is why archaeologists today treat these objects with such reverence, not as puzzles to solve, but as relationships to enter. Because each figurine is a fragment of an inner world, a glimpse into the emotional and cognitive life of a person who lived without cities, without writing, without kings, but not without wonder. And wonder, it turns out, leaves a mark. Some of the oldest Venus figures are made not of stone, but of fired clay. The figurine from Dolní Věstonice in what is now the Czech Republic is over 25,000 years old, one of the oldest known ceramics in the world. That means humans invented firing clay for the sake of art before they did it for pots or storage. They created technology to express something, not just to contain it. Pause there for a moment. Before agriculture, before metallurgy, before permanent homes, there was sculpture, there was symbolism, there was the need to make the unseen visible, to place form on feeling. This tells us something profound. The need to represent the body, the need to symbolize identity, life, and the sacred, is not an afterthought of civilization. It is the foundation. The urge to make meaning predates almost everything we now call advanced, and the figure most often chosen for this meaning-making was a woman. But not just any woman. A woman rendered beyond specificity. No face, no name, only form. That made her universal. A vessel for projection, reflection, identification. She could be mother, self, spirit, earth. She could be all of them at once. And in being all of them, she became something even more enduring. A symbol of continuity, across ice ages, across migrations, across the rise and fall of languages, empires and borders. The Venus figurines endured, because the story they told was not just about one woman. It was about all of us. Because to look upon the Venus figurines today is to be seen through time, by hands that carved without writing, by minds that dreamed in shape rather than speech. They reach across millennia not to give us answers, but to ask us better questions. Who are we when nothing is written? What do we choose to carve when the future is uncertain? What form does memory take when it must outlast even language? These are not simple questions. They are ancient. They are ongoing. And the Venus offers no single response, only presence. She endures, quietly, as stone, as ivory, as clay, as artifact, as symbol, as silence made visible. Some scholars suggest these figurines were used in rites, perhaps as fertility charms or as part of coming-of-age ceremonies. Others argue they were tokens of identity, passed from one group to another, binding communities through shared forms. Still others suggest they were mnemonic devices, part of oral traditions lost to time. But even as we debate, the figurine itself remains still, entire, observing us as much as we observe it. In that way, she reflects a truth about art that echoes into modernity. Not all meaning is meant to be solved. Some meaning is meant to be lived with. The Venus figurines remind us that the prehistoric mind was not primitive. It was imaginative, capable of abstraction, metaphor, intention, capable of projecting spirit into matter, of assigning shape to the ineffable, of reaching into the void and returning with form. They remind us that women, and the idea of woman, were central to the earliest mythologies we ever shaped. Not because they were idealized or subjugated, but because they mattered. They embodied the most immediate miracle early humans could comprehend, the ability to create life, to survive winter, to hold the future in flesh. And so, through each carving, each rounded stone, each careful polish of the surface, a quiet chorus echoes forward. We were here. We carried life. We carried meaning. In this way, the Venus figurines are not lost relics. They are living conversations. They do not belong to the past. They belong to the lineage of all those who shape and dream and wonder, all those who look down at their own form and think, I will make this known. In this light, we are not so far from the woman who carved herself. When we create, when we paint or sculpt or speak a truth into being, we participate in the same gesture. We declare ourselves present in the face of impermanence. And in doing so, we continue the story. A story that began before gods, before kings, before written names. A story told in curves, in stone, in silence. A story told by the first artist, a woman who carved herself. The bones remember. In wind-scoured valleys, beneath layers of sediment and silence, they lie tangled. Ribs cleaved by stone, skulls split with precision, tendons once pulled taut between hunger and survival. Before language, before symbols, before the carvings of gods or the weight of laws, there was this, the hunt. It was not simply an act of feeding. It was choreography, strategy, a communion of motion and intention, a test not only of strength but of story. Because in the blood and breath of the chase, early humans found something far more enduring than meat. They found meaning. But what is it that we truly hunted? The Ice Age world was a place of immensity. Great mammals roamed the plains in herds that darkened the horizon. Mammoths and mastodons, woolly rhinos, giant deer with antlers like trees. And against them, the hunter stood barefoot, clothed in hide, wielding sharpened stone and woven rope. Fragile, small, a creature of thought and coordination, not claw or fang. The odds were unforgiving, and so humans hunted together. Cooperation was not optional. It was the only way forward. The kill depended not just on muscle, but on trust, on the silent choreography of bodies moving through tall grass, on signals passed with a glance, on roles assigned and remembered, flankers, drivers, closers, watchers. Even today, traces of these roles are visible in the bones of the prey, in the angle of a spear wound, in the distribution of carcass parts across a site. The kill site was a canvas, the butchery pattern, a signature. How do we read these ancient signatures? Archaeology becomes a kind of forensic theatre. In places like Boxgrove in England or Schöningen in Germany, spears lie buried beside horse and deer bones, each arranged with a subtle but deliberate logic. Muscle groups separated cleanly, marrow extracted with care. There is no waste in these kills. Every sinew, every sliver of hide, every fragment of bone was used, shaped, absorbed. Even broken blades, microliths embedded in joints or snapped under pressure, speak of stories, of failures and triumphs etched into flint. And then there are the tools themselves, worn not by time, but by purpose. Microscopic patterns of polish and striation on the edges of stone flakes whisper of tendons cut, hides scraped, meat separated. From a distance, it may look like debris. Up close, it is autobiography. But to hunt was not only to kill, it was to enter a relationship with the world, a rhythm of predator and prey that shaped not just diet but destiny. The hunt determined where people moved, when they stayed, who led, who followed, who told the story beside the fire when night came and the blood dried. Every successful kill elevated not just the body, but the group. Each hunt carried lessons, rituals, even taboos. To be chosen to participate was not only a mark of strength, it was a mark of trust. And so we must ask, what was passed down in those hunts, beyond meat and hide? What invisible inheritance travelled between generations? Encoded not in genes, but in movement, in myth, in the memory of the chase. What do we truly inherit from those who ran before us? Perhaps it begins with rhythm, the pulse of footsteps in sync, the hush before a strike, the breath held at the moment of release. Early humans learned the land not from above, like a map, but from within, step by step, ridge by ridge, season by season. Tracking was an act of intimacy. To follow an animal was to read its story, where it paused, where it limped, where it fled. Tracks were not just impressions in mud, they were narratives, and to read them was to enter the mind of the hunted. In this way, the hunt was never solely about conquest, it was about empathy. Strange as it may sound, the most successful hunters were those who could become the animal, if only for a moment, to move as it moved, to think as it thought. This merging between predator and prey birthed something new in the human mind, a capacity for imagination, for projection, for symbolic understanding, the beginnings, perhaps, of mythology. Kill sites are more than crime scenes, they are stages. In places like the Grotte du Bison in France, archaeologists have uncovered layers of reindeer and bison remains that span centuries, each layer repeating the same story: a seasonal return, a practiced kill, a shared meal. These were not random acts, they were rituals, group memory encoded in place. Some sites reveal patterns of butchery so consistent, so careful, they suggest rules, guiding who cut what, who received which part, who got first fire. These rules hint at early social structures, hierarchies not built with crowns or walls, but with repetition and trust. In the hunt, leaders emerged not by dominance alone, but by knowledge, knowing when to strike, where to stand, how to read the wind. Even children played a role. Flint shards found beside juvenile footprints suggest that the learning began early, not in lectures but in observation, in mimicry, in quiet apprenticeship to the hunt. And yet the evidence tells a story of change. As the Ice Age waned, and glaciers pulled back into the mountains, the great herds began to dwindle. The landscapes that once teemed with prey shifted, wetlands expanded, forests grew thicker. The open plains that favoured coordinated chases gave way to tangled woods and unpredictable weather. Hunting strategies had to adapt, or fail, and many did fail. The extinction of megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, was not a single moment, but a long goodbye. Climate, human pressure, ecological dominoes, no single cause, but a convergence. A shifting world that left fewer and fewer places for the old ways to endure. What happens to a culture when the animal it's built around vanishes? The memory of the hunt does not fade easily. It survives in ritual, in dance, in oral tales passed down beside fires that burned smaller than they once did. Even when the great prey disappeared, the story remained. Because long after the spear is dropped, the memory of the chase still runs. It runs in ceremony, in the ways people gathered to remember what had been lost, and to rehearse what must not be forgotten. Across cultures and continents, echoes of the Paleolithic hunt reverberate in traditions where animals are honoured before they are taken, where dances mimic the motions of prey, where myths begin not with gods but with beasts. These are not mere performances, they are remembrances, reenactments of bonds that once bound humans to the living world in ways modern minds can scarcely grasp. And yet, even these memories had to evolve. With the disappearance of many of the great Ice Age mammals, smaller game became more central. Deer, boar, hare, birds. Hunting changed in scale, in strategy. Traps replaced chases, arrows replaced thrusting spears. Stillness became as powerful as strength. New toolkits emerged, microliths hafted into composite weapons, snares woven from plant fibers, atlatls to extend reach and power. These were not the tools of brute force, they were the tools of subtlety. We see this transformation in the archaeological record. At sites like Stellmore in northern Germany, reindeer bones show evidence of systematic hunting with advanced projectiles. In Japan, the Jomon culture crafted intricately barbed harpoons to harvest fish and marine mammals. Across the Americas, Clovis points, fluted stone blades designed for deep penetration, testify to a sophisticated, perhaps desperate pursuit of dwindling megafauna. The hunt did not vanish. It adapted, became more localized, more diverse. But something intangible shifted as well. The kill no longer defined the community in quite the same way. Other aspects of life, gathering, crafting, ritual, grew in prominence. The balance of survival recalibrated, and so did memory. The great hunt, now rarer, became mythologized. Tales grew around it, of giant stags that could never be caught, of mammoths that returned in dreams, of ancestors who could speak with animals. The fading of the actual made space for the emergence of the symbolic. The chase moved from the plain to the mind. It is in this period that we see the rise of shamanic traditions, where the line between human and animal blurs not on the ground but in the spirit world. Cave paintings in places like Trois Frères in France show half-human, half-beast figures, perhaps the first depictions of those who carried the hunt into trance and vision. These were not just hunters of flesh, they were hunters of knowledge, of insight, of power, and all of it rooted in that first ancestral act, to pursue life through motion, to know the land through the body, to survive through synchrony. Even today, deep within our physiology, the hunt lingers, in the sharpness of our gaze at movement, in the surge of adrenaline at the chase. In the rituals of sport and story, these are not accidents, they are inheritances. What we hunted shaped what we became, and what we lost reshaped what we remembered. But the question remains, what is the cost of forgetting? When the last mammoth fell, it was not just an animal that vanished, it was a world, a way of being, a rhythm of life that had pulsed through human bones for tens of thousands of years. The silence that followed was not only ecological, it was cultural, an erasure of experience so profound that entire modes of knowledge, tracking, trapping, chasing, preparing, began to fade, even as they were transformed into memory, into myth. The extinction of the megafauna marks one of prehistory's great ruptures. While debate continues around the role of human hunting versus climatic instability, it is clear that Homo sapiens stood at the center of the shift, not solely as destroyers, but as participants in a fragile, complex ecological drama. The prey were not endless, and the hunters, in becoming apex, had to grapple with the loneliness that comes with power. We find hints of this grief carved into antler and stone, a carved mammoth on a piece of ivory, dated to the twilight of their existence, a painted bison on a cave wall, rendered with a grace that suggests reverence, not domination. These were not crude trophies, they were elegies, and so began a subtle turning inward. Without the great herds to guide movement, some groups began to settle, at least seasonally. They returned to the same rivers, the same coasts. They observed animal migrations not just as hunters, but as witnesses. Fishing emerged, trapping grew more refined. And slowly the pace of life shifted from the wild pulse of the chase to the steadier beat of foraging and dwelling. But memory clings. In societies where hunting remained central, such as the later Mesolithic groups of northern Europe or the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the hunt retained its spiritual gravity. It was never merely economic, it was cosmological. Ceremonies were performed to ensure the animal's spirit returned, to keep the balance. In the Inuit tradition, for instance, a hunted seal's soul was respected with ritual gestures and songs, acts echoing the deep Paleolithic past. Even where agriculture began to rise, the hunt lingered in stories. Heroes in early myths, Gilgamesh, Heracles, Odysseus, all faced beasts, monsters, wild things. The hunt became metaphor, not only for survival, but for self-confrontation. for transformation. This symbolic shift reveals something profound. The memory of the hunt is not preserved in facts alone, it is encoded in feeling. In the awe of the animal, the fear of the open, the exhilaration of pursuit. These emotional residues carried forward, long after the bones were buried, long after the last arrow flew. And so, in a world that was changing, slowly, steadily, the memory of the hunt became one of humanity's deepest roots, a reminder that we were once in motion, that we once knew the land not through borders, but through breath, not through ownership, but through exchange. But memory is not always benign. What happens when the hunter forgets they were once part of the circle? Disconnection begins quietly, with the erosion of reciprocity, with the fading of stories that once bound the hunter to the hunted in mutual recognition. As human societies move toward agriculture, and later toward domestication and industry, the hunt, as ritual, as rhythm, as reverence, diminished. It became sport, economy, spectacle. The animal, once a partner in a shared choreography of survival, was redefined as resource, as object. And yet, beneath this shift the deeper memory remained. Dormant perhaps, disguised, but not gone. We see its ghost in our metaphors, target, pursuit, track record, in the crosshairs. The language of hunting has bled into the fabric of how we think, compete, plan. Even in boardrooms and battlefields, the ancient grammar of the chase persists, but in certain places the older memory still stirs. Among the San of southern Africa, whose traditions stretch back over tens of thousands of years, hunting remains both sustenance and ceremony. Their persistence hunts, running antelope to exhaustion under the searing sun, require not only endurance, but empathy. The hunter imagines the animal's fear, its route, its hesitation. It is a hunt conducted through identification, not separation. And when the animal falls, it is thanked, named, mourned. Such acts remind us that the memory of the hunt is not a relic. It is a mirror. It reflects our capacity for attunement, for reading wind, listening to hooves in the dark, knowing when to wait and when to move. It reflects our capacity for community, for cooperating in silence, trusting others to act, sharing the feast. And it reflects our capacity for story, for remembering not just what we did, but what it meant. When the prey disappeared, we did not stop hunting. We turned our gaze inward. Today, we hunt knowledge, clarity, meaning. We chase the echoes of our past across dry lake beds and glacial valleys, through excavation and analysis, through dreams painted on stone. The archaeologist with her trowel, the paleoanthropologist with his core samples, the storyteller with a microphone. They are all hunters in their own way, tracking the movements of those who came before. And what they find, more than anything, is that the hunt was never about hunger alone. It was about connection, to the herd, to the land, to one another. To lose that connection is to become adrift in the very world we once knew so intimately. But to remember it, to walk again the paths carved by hoof and foot, to sit beside the ancient fires, to feel the pulse of the chase not as conquest, but as communion, that is to return, to re-enter the circle, to recover the rhythm. The memory of the hunt is not just a story of survival, it is the origin of meaning. And in its echo we may still hear the first beat of the human heart. They gathered where the land remembered them. Before the lines of city walls were etched in stone, before the first seed was willingly surrendered to soil, before any god demanded a temple, there were places where humans came together, not to farm, not to rule, but to witness, to see one another, to feel part of something greater than the self. And though the names of these places are lost, the bones of their gatherings remain half buried beneath millennia, whispering of something radical. That community can precede economy. That meaning can be born without surplus, that belief may come before bread. At the top of a hill in southeastern Anatolia, the stones of Göbekli Tepe still hold their silence. For more than 11,000 years they stood buried, preserved not by accident but by intention. And when they were unearthed, they did not speak of villages or agriculture or permanent homes. They spoke of vision, carved with animals, abstract symbols and pillars that tower beyond the height of a man. Göbekli Tepe was not a shelter. It was not storage. It was something else entirely, something ritual. But how did nomadic hunter-gatherers raise such megaliths? How did those who moved with the seasons return, again and again, to the same sacred ground? And what did it mean that they built monuments before they built houses? The answer may lie not in utility, but in unity. These early sanctuaries may have functioned as centres of gathering long before the word centre meant anything fixed. Here, the scattered threads of tribe and clan could be woven, however briefly, into a larger tapestry. Ritual, whatever its purpose, offered cohesion. Shared labour offered identity. Perhaps in the act of heaving stone, they sculpted not just altars but a social world, a mirror that reflected them back to each other. How many stories began there? How many names, now lost, were first spoken in that circle of stone? We often imagine social complexity as a fruit of settled life. But what if it was the other way around? What if it was precisely the hunger for meaning, for communion, for a shared mythology that gave rise to the settlements that would one day become cities? Archaeologists now speak of other sites, Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, with its astronomical alignments, the stone circles of the British Isles, the gathering grounds of the Natufian culture in the Levant. These places too bear the markings of intention without agriculture, of design without domestication. They suggest that the mind of civilization, the part that dreams of architecture, of law, of story, was already alive in the bodies of nomads. And so we ask, what came first, the field or the festival, the crop or the covenant? Could it be that civilization was first dreamed not in granaries, but in songs? That the sacred preceded the practical? If so, then our roots run deeper than we thought. Not into soil, but into symbol. Not into ownership, but into awe. The stones at Göbekli Tepe were not the beginning of buildings. They were the beginning of belonging. And to belong before all else is to gather. This gathering, repeated over generations, seeded something deeper than territory. A rhythm. A heartbeat larger than the individual, pulsing across time. To stand among those pillars was not just to mark the seasons or honour the spirits. It was to feel oneself a note in a longer song. The idea that people who had no farms, no written laws, no central authority, could still build something, this complex challenges everything we assumed about the path of civilization. In the traditional timeline, agriculture begets surplus, surplus begets hierarchy, hierarchy builds monuments, but here the sequence is inverted. Here the sacred came first. Imagine it. Bands of nomads arriving from scattered hills and dry valleys, gathering under a moonlit sky. Perhaps they brought with them stories, or bones, or songs only sung in that place. And for a brief moment, difference dissolved. Tribes that may have once competed for game or water now stood shoulder to shoulder, carving limestone into myth. Cooperation without coercion, structure without settlement. It is a model so alien to our modern sensibilities that we're still learning how to see it clearly. But the idea wasn't limited to Anatolia. At Nabta Playa, far to the south in what is now the Sahara, stone alignments mark the solstices, long before the Egyptian pyramids ever pierced the sky. There was no wheat, no barley, no walled city here, just circles of stone and fire pits, and the bones of animals arranged with care. Ritual? Again, without residents. These places are not villages in the way we now define them. They are not defined by daily life, by walls or wells or workshops. They are defined by memory, by return, and most crucially, by participation. Unlike later temples, closed, hierarchical, controlled, these early sites seem open, inclusive, communal. They do not impose belief, they invite experience. This subtle distinction matters, because it means that before we lived in permanent structures, we may have already begun building something else, a shared cosmology, a web of meaning stretched between people, places, and time, a kind of scaffolding for the future, not in wood or stone, but in custom, in repetition, in ritual motion, approach, encircle, offer, depart. The people who gathered at these sites were not citizens of a city. They were custodians of a pattern, and the pattern did not belong to anyone. It could not be owned. It could only be enacted, again and again, until the path itself became sacred. Perhaps that is why they returned. Not because they had to, but because something in them already knew. To remember who you are, you must sometimes walk the old paths, even if they vanish beneath your feet. To return to a place without signs, without roads, without markers, is not an act of geography. It is an act of memory. These journeys, made over generations, speak of something encoded not just in maps, but in minds. A mental landscape, where stories cling to stones and meaning lives in the bend of a hill. Before there were towns, there were trails, not worn by commerce, but by reverence. This memory-bound movement suggests a kind of proto-civilization. Not one of permanence, but of recurrence. Not structured by fences, but by the pull of shared gravity. Göbekli Tepe and its distant cousins hint at this unseen architecture, a civilization of return. One not ruled by kings, but by myth. Not ordered by law, but by law. And what bound these returners together? Not wealth, not defence, but something more elusive, something internal. The desire to connect not only with one another, but with a world alive with meaning. Each carved animal, each abstract glyph, seems to pulse with intention. Not utilitarian, but communicative, like whispers etched in stone. Scholars argue over the meanings. Were these fertility cults, astronomical observatories, proto-religions? But perhaps the question itself misses the point. The carvings were not meant to be read the way we read books. They were meant to be experienced, stood before, touched perhaps in ritual silence. They were a language that didn't explain, it revealed. And in that revelation, the group was reshaped. Participation in the ritual was not passive. To lift a pillar into place, to prepare offerings, to sing the old songs under the same moon, it required collaboration, synchrony, even planning. These were not fleeting encounters. They demanded preparation, foresight, and coordination, which meant that even before agriculture formalized seasons, ritual may have already mapped the year. The ceremony taught people how to work together, and in that work, society was born. Not every gathering was peaceful. That much we can guess. Even among shared rituals, tension would flare, over access, over memory, over belonging. But these frictions didn't erase the function of the gathering, they refined it. In returning again and again, these groups had to negotiate difference, to make room, to reweave what had frayed. Some scholars believe these sacred centres were neutral zones, safe ground between otherwise competing groups, a kind of social pressure valve. If true, then Göbekli Tepe and its kin served not just spiritual needs, but political ones. They didn't just sanctify the cosmos, they stabilized society. And then, they disappeared. Göbekli Tepe was buried by those who built it, intentionally entombed beneath layers of earth, not destroyed, not abandoned, but sealed, as if the memory was too sacred to leave open, or perhaps too powerful. What does it mean to bury a sacred place? What does it mean to deliberately forget? To bury a place that once anchored your world is to release it, not into oblivion, but into myth. The fill that covered Göbekli Tepe was careful, almost reverent. Not the chaos of collapse, but the quiet sealing of a chapter. Perhaps the site had done its work. Perhaps the stories it held had been absorbed into new forms, new places. Civilization was stirring, agriculture was emerging, the world was about to change, and maybe the old gods had to be put to sleep. But what emerged next did not erase the memory of those places. In fact, some argue that the world's first temples, shrines, and even cities echoed the design of these earlier ritual sites. The same circles, the same alignments, the same sense of sacred approach. Only now they were surrounded by dwellings. Life had moved in. This shift from return to residence marks a turning point. No longer just pilgrims, people began to stay. The hearth replaced the path. The ritual space became the village square, and with it came the slow unfolding of hierarchy, permanence, and control. But even as society hardened, something softer remained. In Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest known proto-cities, we see homes built tightly together, walls touching, no streets in the modern sense, just rooftops forming a web of proximity. Inside the homes we find painted walls, bullhorns, ancestral skulls buried beneath the floor. Here, Domestic life and spiritual life were not yet divided. The sacred still lived at home. This blurring of lines between ritual and routine, between myth and memory, is the lingering echo of the village before the village. It reminds us that civilization did not arise from a vacuum. It did not explode into being fully formed. It crystallized, slowly, from patterns laid down long before. And at the centre of those patterns was not grain or gold, but gathering. Ritual sites like Göbekli Tepe were not outliers. They were blueprints, prototypes of social cohesion. Before politics, before property, people came together to make meaning. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That, perhaps, is the quiet foundation of civilization. Not the seed, but the soil. And what of religion? If it was present, it was not yet doctrine. It was felt, not followed. It did not bind with dogma, but with wonder. The kind of wonder that stares into the sky and sees stories, that walks a circle and feels time, that carves a fox or a bird into stone and believes, not in explanation, but in connection. In this way, the sacred preceded the settled, not as commandment, but as invitation. And this invitation, extended across centuries, still echoes in us. When we gather in circles, when we light fires, when we sing together under stars, we are in some quiet way returning to a place not marked on any map, but remembered in the bones. Because what we call prehistory is not the absence of civilization. It is its rehearsal. A slow, aching performance stretched over millennia. Before written laws, there were spoken promises. Before walls, there were lines drawn in sand. And before the first granary was ever filled, there was a gathering, a circle, a song, a shared fire. The people who walked away from Göbekli Tepe did not know they were leaving something behind. They simply moved with the seasons, as they always had. But what remained beneath the soil was more than stone. It was a fossil of intention, a memory made solid. And when the next generations built their homes and their towns and their temples, the shape of what had come before whispered through their tools and layouts and prayers. It's tempting to think of agriculture as the beginning, to mark the invention of farming as the line between wildness and culture. But the roots of who we are dig deeper. Before we planted crops, we planted meaning. Before we built cities, we built story. And so we find ourselves in a strange position, looking back not to find the origin of civilization, but its shadow, its breath, its murmur. The village before the village is not a place we can fully excavate. Its boundaries are not etched in earth. Its structures do not stand. And yet, it is there, in the grooves of ritual, in the ghosts of gathering, in the silent architecture of memory. We carry it with us, every time we return to a place of meaning, every time we stand together for something larger than ourselves, every time we pause in silence to feel the weight of being. We are answering an ancient call, one that does not ask for conquest or permanence, but for presence. And perhaps that is what those stone circles really meant. Not a demand, not a doctrine, but a moment to gather and remember and return. Civilization would come, villages would rise, walls would grow thick, hierarchies would harden, but beneath it all, always, would be this: a shared place, a shared story, a shared sky. The village before the village is not gone. It lives wherever we choose to return. The most consequential revolution in human history did not announce itself with fanfare or fire. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, not in the clang of metal or the construction of monuments, but in the soft, deliberate planting of seeds, wheat, barley, millet. Grasses once wild, barely noticed by the wandering bands of hunter-gatherers, became the architects of a new world, and the cost of that transformation, measured not just in bodies or boundaries, but in the bending of time and the reshaping of human identity, would unfold slowly, generation by generation, across the skin of the earth. What does it mean to domesticate a plant? To coax life from soil with the promise of return? In the Levant some 12,000 years ago, the first tender shoots of einkorn and emmer wheat emerged in cultivated rows, no longer wild, no longer free. It began in the Fertile Crescent, but it was not confined there. Across the Zagros Mountains, barley found favour. Further east, millet and rice. In Mesoamerica, maize. Every continent in its time cradled its own botanical offering, and each became the seed of civilizations yet to rise. But these were not gifts. They were bargains, and they came with terms. The term was toil. Foragers once moved through the world in fluid rhythm, following the migrations of animals and the flowering of trees. Now they remained rooted, not by choice, but by necessity. A field must be cleared, sowed, watched, defended. And so began the great tethering, of people to place, of seasons to ritual, of harvests to hope. The village grew from the granary, not the other way around. Agriculture did not respond to civilization, it dictated its shape. But if plants were being shaped, so too were people. Grains that had once resisted digestion were selectively bred for softness, for sweetness, for yield. In parallel, the jaws of humans shrank, their guts adapted, their enzymes shifted. The body bent to the field, and the field bent to the will of the body. In bones and teeth, archaeologists trace this transformation, the narrowing of pelvises, the shortening of stature, the slow emergence of anemia and arthritis. Progress, it seemed, had a price, and yet, in this exchange, humanity was not diminished. It was changed. What compelled them to stay? Was it the allure of surplus, the promise of stability, the quiet seduction of stored grain? Or was it something older, something primal? A desire to shape the world rather than be shaped by it, to leave behind the randomness of the hunt, the uncertainty of the forest, and replace it with order, rows, fences, patterns that mimicked thought itself, a kind of logic etched into the earth. And if farming was a language, what was it saying? Each furrow in the soil was a sentence in a story that would never again be unwritten. Each seed planted was a pact with the future, a promise made on behalf of children not yet born. But what was promised, and what was sacrificed in return? The promise was abundance. The sacrifice was freedom. The promise was stability. The sacrifice was time. In the wild world before farming, the rhythm of life had been dictated by movement. Food appeared and vanished with the seasons. People followed its trail, learning the pulse of the earth through migration and instinct. But with cultivation came stillness, and with stillness came structure. To plant is to plan, to anticipate the future. It is to bind oneself to tomorrow's hunger before today's has even been sated. And so, the first farmers became keepers of time. Calendars were born not from astronomy, but from agriculture. The observation of the stars, the solstice, the equinox, was not idle wonder. It was necessity. To miss a season was to lose a crop. To lose a crop was to risk starvation. Thus the sky became a clock, and ritual became a tool of survival. The festival, the offering, the dance, these were not leisure but maintenance. The earth demanded remembrance. Yet beneath the miracle of cultivation, something shifted in the soul. The egalitarian spirit of hunter-gatherer life, the shared distribution of meat and forage, the communal flow of movement, gave way to the logic of ownership. A field was not easily shared. A stored harvest could be measured, guarded, claimed. The earth itself became property, and with property came hierarchy. Archaeological layers from early Neolithic settlements, Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Mehrgar, speak of these transitions. The earliest homes were simple, mud brick walls, shared courtyards, no distinction between rich or poor. But over time, differences began to emerge. Grain storage pits varied in size. Some families accumulated more, others fell into dependence. The seeds of inequality sprouted long before cities did. And this inequality grew in more ways than one. Gender, too, began to bend beneath the new labour of the field. In hunter-gatherer bands, women often gathered, men often hunted, but both roles required mobility, cooperation, adaptability. With sedentary life came specialisation and division. The steady work of planting, grinding and processing grain fell largely to women, while men took on the protection of the settled site, the tending of herds, the defence of harvests. The division was not immediate nor universal, but it deepened as generations passed. Tools tell part of the story. In the worn grooves of grinding stones, scientists have found traces of repetitive stress injuries, disproportionately in female skeletons. Knees, spines, wrists, all bearing the imprint of millennia spent at the millstone. The first harvest nourished the many, but it also burdened the few, and yet, even this hardship was wrapped in meaning. The labour of cultivation was sanctified, woven into myth. The earth became a mother, her soil a womb. Seeds were planted like prayers, deaths followed by rebirths each spring. The first farmers saw in their work the same cycle that governed their own lives: decay, transformation, renewal. It was not yet religion, not yet doctrine, but the first theology of toil was already growing from the ground, and from that soil both civilization and subjugation would rise. The paradox of the first harvest is that it granted humanity mastery over nature, and at the same time made humanity its servant. What began as liberation from scarcity became an unending negotiation with the land itself. Crops demanded tending, irrigation, protection. A bad season meant not migration, but famine. The freedom to move had been traded for the responsibility to stay. The hunter had become the farmer, and the farmer could not leave. This was the dawn of sedentism, the tethering of the human body to a single place. The rhythm of walking gave way to the rhythm of waiting. The horizon shrank to the boundaries of a field, and in that narrowing of space came the widening of thought. The need to manage surplus, to coordinate labour, to predict seasons, all demanded new systems of order. The field, in its quiet geometry, taught humanity to think abstractly. The world itself became a pattern. In the Fertile Crescent, people learned to build irrigation channels, directing rivers like veins through the soil. Clay tokens began to appear, counters used to track quantities of grain and livestock. These would later evolve into proto-writing, a language of commerce before language itself. In a sense, the first accountants were priests, and the first prayers were inventories. Counting and worship grew from the same root, awe at what could be created and fear of what could be lost. But for all its gifts, agriculture reshaped more than economy. It redefined what it meant to live together. The Neolithic village, unlike the ritual sites of old, required constant cooperation. There were harvests to divide, disputes to settle, seeds to share. Leadership emerged not through strength or charisma alone, but through possession. Those who owned the most fertile plots, or controlled the grain stores, began to hold sway. The first social hierarchies were not built in palaces but in granaries, and with ownership came exclusion. To own land was to draw a line, to mark what was ours and what was theirs. Fences, first made to keep animals in, soon kept people out. The egalitarian mobility of the Paleolithic world dissolved into boundaries, legal, social, and eventually spiritual. The gods themselves began to mirror this shift. Once diffuse and animistic, they now took on roles of guardians, rulers, kings. The cosmos began to reflect the structure of the village. Even the seasons took on moral weight. Fertility was virtue, barrenness was sin. The harvest became a measure of worth. A good crop meant favour, a failed one, punishment. Humanity, for the first time, found itself judged not by the chase, but by the yield. Yet beneath this order, another memory lingered. The memory of the wild, of movement, of unbound belonging. The first farmers still sang songs of the hunt. They still painted animals on their pottery and buried tools beside the dead. They remembered a world before the plough, even as they sharpened its blade. Because every seed planted is also a burial. Something must die for something else to grow. This was the silent pact of agriculture, a contract written not in ink but in ash and bone. The forest was burned so fields could be cleared. The wild grasses were pulled and replaced with barley. The old gods of the wilderness, the wolf, the tree, the storm, faded into shadows as new spirits emerged. The grain goddess, the harvest father, the guardian of stored life. Human beings were no longer guests of the land. They had become its architects and its prisoners. The architecture of life itself began to harden. Homes, once temporary shelters for the migratory, became permanent structures. Storage rooms and hearths replaced open skies. Generations lived in the same space. Their identities layered like sediment. Ancestors were buried beneath the floors, as if rooting the living to the ground through blood and memory. With each season, the land became more than just food. It became lineage, and with lineage came inheritance. A father could pass his field to his son, a mother could pass her grindstone to her daughter. And in doing so, a new concept was born, the future. No longer a place of open possibility, The future became a thing to be prepared for, preserved, and feared. Farming, unlike foraging, had consequences that stretched far beyond one's own life. A poorly kept field meant suffering not just now, but for children not yet born. This temporal shift, this anchoring in both place and time, transformed not only society, but the self. Work was no longer reactive, but anticipatory. People began to think in years, in seasons, in generations. Rituals evolved to match this new temporal horizon. Fertility rites, harvest festivals, mourning ceremonies for crops and kin. These weren't idle traditions, they were maps for survival, each gesture carrying the weight of collective memory. Yet as the world became more ordered, more predictable, more civil, it also became more vulnerable. Concentration bred risk. A nomadic band might starve if the hunt failed, but they could always move. A farming village rooted in one place was at the mercy of blight, flood, drought, and raiders. Walls began to rise, not just to hold in grain, but to keep out hunger. War, once rare among scattered bands, now became a feature of human life. To defend food was to defend life itself. This necessity for protection gave rise to new social roles. Warriors, guards, leaders of men. Power was no longer just about spiritual insight or kinship wisdom. It became about control of land, of surplus, of people. And thus the seed of the state was planted. Not in a palace, not in a law, but in a barley field. In the way one person could command others to till it, to guard it, to bow before its bounty. The village became a proto-city. The granary became a symbol of divine favour, and the earth, once an open book of mystery, was now a ledger to be balanced. Sowing, reaping, storing, taxing. From the breath of the wild came the first exhale of civilization. It was quiet at first. A shift not in thunder but in rhythm. A people who once followed the rains now waited for them. A society that once scattered in drought now huddled together, guarding their silos like sacred relics. With this stillness came new forms of expression. Inscribed tablets to account for the grain, woven cloth dyed with symbols of fertility, clay seals marking ownership and trust. The land spoke, and now so did the people, more precisely, more permanently. It was the Neolithic mind awakening to a world it had partially made. There was awe in this creation, the miracle of seeds sprouting from bare earth, of animals yielding milk and meat within fences. But there was also a burden. The world was no longer a gift, it was a project. Each year, more fields had to be cleared, more hands were needed, children became labourers, women who once foraged with autonomy were now confined to hearth and cradle, while men's labour increasingly turned outward, toward oxen, ploughs and patrol. Inequality found its soil in the furrows of grain. As some accumulated more grain, more cattle, more land, they began to shape belief to justify their power. Myths emerged of chosen lineages, of divine right, of sacred land. These weren't lies, they were frameworks, ways of making sense of a world that had become both abundant and unequal. The gods were no longer among the trees, they were enthroned in the granary, watching, tallying, rewarding. Still, resistance flickered. Archaeological evidence shows that many early farming communities operated collectively, without rulers. Fields were shared, storage communal, decisions made by consensus. The village was not yet a kingdom. The plough had not yet turned into a weapon. But the pressures were mounting. Population growth, ecological strain, the spread of farming into new lands, often displacing those who lived otherwise. It was not inevitable, but it was persuasive. Agriculture seduced with its promise of certainty. Even as backs broke beneath the yoke and blisters formed around the handle of the sickle, there was a sense of progress. The storage jar was full. The future felt less like a gamble and more like a plan. Roads began to form between settlements. Trade expanded. Obsidian, salt, shell. Even the gods began to travel. Their images exchanged. Their names whispered across new tongues. But always, in the grain, was the ghost of the wild, the curve of an antler etched into pottery, the painting of a bird not for food but for memory. In every village a remnant of the forest lingered. Humanity had planted itself. Yes, but it still remembered how to run. And so we arrived at the edge of something vast, from seed to settlement, from ritual to rule. The first harvest had given us more than food. It had given us history, not in writing, yet, but in layers of soil, of custom, of choice. The Neolithic Revolution was not an explosion, but a long inhale, a drawing inward, a becoming. And in that stillness, civilization waited. The Stone Age did not end because the world grew tired of stone. It ended because memory became sharper than flint. There is a moment in time, silent, liminal, where the myths of the hunter fade beneath the shadow of the wall. Not the walls of caves, painted with ochre and breath, but walls built to endure, to contain, to divide. At the threshold between what we now call prehistory and history, something imperceptible began to change. The earth, long shaped by hands that left no words, now trembled under the weight of those who would name, number, and remember. What must it have felt like to witness the first glimmer of writing before knowing what writing was? Not the polished cuneiform tablets of Sumer, nor the neat lines of hieroglyphs carved in stone, but the earliest scratchings, tokens, marks, pictographs, fragments of an intention. Somewhere, someone placed a symbol in clay not to decorate, not to pray, but to remember. Memory was no longer just a whisper in a grandmother's story, or the scars on a hunter's arms. Memory became transferable, preservable, external, and with that humanity crossed an invisible line. But the threshold of the Bronze Age was not merely a technological boundary, it was a psychological break. The people who rose with the sun and hunted beneath its light were giving way to those who would stay, who would build, dig, and measure. Fields expanded like spiderwebs across fertile valleys. Trade routes shimmered with copper and tin. Cities began to flicker into being, not yet the empires of later millennia, but clusters of permanence and planning. And though the stone tools of the past were not forgotten overnight, they began to feel like echoes. Even as some still used them, their meaning shifted, from tools of daily survival to relics of another world. But who held that memory? Who remembered what came before walls and fields? Did the farmers of Çatalhöyük gaze at the horizon and feel something missing from the stories passed down in their hearth-lit rooms? Did the traders along the Danube remember the songs of ancestors who once danced in forests beneath nothing but stars? Or did the slow drumbeat of permanence drown the voice of the wild? Civilization is a palimpsest. Every new structure laid atop the bones of what came before, every city a tomb for forgotten tongues. And as the Bronze Age crept forward, the very act of forgetting became essential. To govern, one must simplify. To trade, one must measure. To command, one must write. Yet for every name etched in bronze, 1,000 faces vanished from memory. For every myth scribed in ink, entire cosmologies faded like smoke. What is the cost of remembering with ink rather than with story, with number rather than with rhythm? What parts of the soul are traded when memory is etched into tablets instead of whispered through firelight? Because the moment we choose to write, we also choose to forget how to remember. Oral memory lives in the body, passed between mouths and hearts, shaped by breath and silence. But the written word is external, permanent, unyielding. It freezes thought into form, calcifies meaning, and though it preserves, it also displaces. What was once held communally, flexibly, ritually, becomes singular, fixed, and codified. This transition wasn't uniform, it didn't happen everywhere at once. Some communities lingered in the old ways, carrying their stories on the wind, carving their meanings into wood, ash, and rhythm. But others, settled in the floodplains of Mesopotamia, along the Nile near the Indus, began to bind knowledge into script. These weren't just scribbles, they were structures of power, tallies of grain, records of trade, names of kings. To write was to claim, to declare, this happened, this is owed, this is mine. And with those marks came something unprecedented, the abstraction of authority. In proliterate worlds, power was intimate, earned through age or vision, rooted in relationship. But now authority could be anchored in text, in law, in order, in contracts carved in clay. The priest became scribe, the scribe became law, and the people, once held in egalitarian webs of interdependence, began to sort into new hierarchies. Some read, some did not. Some ruled, some did not. This shift, quiet, bureaucratic and slow, was as profound as the taming of fire or the sowing of grain. And yet, even as it spread, it left a peculiar ache. The memory of the hunt still pulsed in dreams. The rhythm of nomadic life echoed in lullabies. The wild was gone, but not forgotten. It clung to the edges of consciousness, to the margins of script. And sometimes, just sometimes, it returned. In the myths of trickster gods who broke rules and crossed borders, in festivals where chaos reigned for a day, where masks hid the face of order, in the sacred spaces tucked into the heart of cities, temples, shrines, sanctuaries, where the old energies still flickered. The people of the Bronze Age may have lived in the age of metal, but they dreamed in stone and fire. Archaeology reveals this duality. We find bronze tools alongside flint blades. We uncover monumental temples just meters from simple hearths. We decode tablets filled with taxes and lists, and beside them we find amulets, charms and songs. The ancient world did not erase its past in one sweeping act. It layered over it, like silt over a riverbed. And beneath the polished surface the Stone Age still breathed. Perhaps it always has, for we too live among these layers. We trace our identities through surnames that once meant hunter or weaver. We gather in cities, but we seek the forest when we need to feel alive. We build in steel, but dream in firelight. And even now, with satellites circling above us, we kneel to the earth to bury our dead. The Stone Age never ended. It simply went underground. It lived on in gestures, in rituals too old to be named. It lived in the way we mark beginnings with fire, candles on a cake, torches in a procession. It lived in the myths that spilled from generation to generation, distorted by time but rooted in something older than scripture. And sometimes it lived in silence, moments when no words are needed because the body remembers. But memory is not always benign. To remember is to carry the weight of what has been lost, and the deeper the memory, the heavier the burden. The transition into the Bronze Age brought wealth, art, architecture. But it also brought war. It brought kings and their armies, slavery, scarcity, the hoarding of grain and the building of walls. Memory became a battleground. Who gets remembered? Who gets erased? We see it in the ruins, the vanished names, the shattered statues, the overwritten tablets. We see it in the silence that surrounds the lives of women, children, outcasts. Prehistory is not just what came before writing. It is everything that was unrecorded, everything deemed unworthy of inscription by those who held the stylus. But prehistory speaks, even now, in bones, in pollen. In the curve of a stone tool buried beneath the floor of a forgotten house. Archaeologists, in many ways, are its translators, not of language, but of life. They read the residue of meals, the patterns of post holes, the discoloration of soil. Each scrap is a syllable, each site is a sentence, each culture a lost library. And yet, for all we've recovered, there is so much more we will never know. A mother's lullaby from 9,000 years ago, the rhythm of a dance around a spring moon, the sound of laughter echoing in a reed-thatched dwelling. These things existed. They mattered. But they left no mark that the earth could keep. They are gone, and that too is part of our inheritance. Still, not everything has been forgotten. There are echoes, in indigenous lifeways that retain sacred relationships with land, kin and spirit. In oral traditions that resist erasure, passed down despite conquest and colonization. In languages that encode ecological wisdom, modern science is only beginning to understand. These are not relics of a vanished past. They are continuities, threads stretching from the oldest hearth to today's flickering screens. To listen to these threads is not nostalgia, it is survival. Because beneath our tools, our networks, our monuments, we are still the same species that once painted bison on cave walls, still drawn to rhythm, to kinship, to meaning. And so we must ask, what parts of our memory are we preserving now? And what are we allowing to slip away? Are our digital records more enduring than carvings in bone, or more fragile? And when we look back 10,000 years from now, what will remain of us? Will it be the glass towers and the carbon traces, the satellites and scripts, or something quieter? A circle of stones, a lullaby in an extinct tongue, a story still being told. Because even at the edge of memory, the human instinct to narrate, to bind the past to the present, remains unbroken. In the final days of the Stone Age, just before writing unfurled across clay and bone, humans were still storytellers. The medium was changing, but the message had been there all along. A handprint on a wall, a grave lined with ochre, a bead passed from palm to palm, each was a whisper across time, a declaration. We were here. As bronze tools began to shape the world with sharper precision, so too did the stories shift in tone. They became anchored in power, etched in hierarchy. Kings began to inscribe their deeds not in the dust but in stone. Priests recorded rituals with symbols too rigid to evolve naturally. Myths, once fluid and communal, hardened into scripture. Memory became architecture, still awe-inspiring but less forgiving. And yet the prehistoric voice persisted, not in defiance but in parallel, in folk practices, in seasonal festivals, in sacred groves spared from the plough. Even in the rhythm of agricultural work, echoes of older, wilder songs continued. The rise of cities did not erase the fire circle, it merely built around it. To walk the line between prehistory and history is to stand between breath and word, between memory as lived and memory as codified. Writing gave us chronology, but it also gave us forgetting. What could not be recorded was dismissed. And so, entire ways of knowing, embodied, spiritual, ecological, fell away from the official record. But they did not vanish. They nested in the crevices of language, in the metaphors we still use. We speak of roots and foundations, of harvests and seasons of change. These are not accidental turns of phrase. They are fossilized memories, reminders of a time when human consciousness moved in step with the turning earth. This is the paradox of progress. As we moved forward, into cities, into writing, into empire, we carried with us fragments of what came before. But each step also cost us something. Intimacy with the land, reverence for cycles, the slowness that made reflection possible. We remember more names, but perhaps fewer truths. Still, there is beauty in this edge, this liminal place where memory becomes history. It reminds us that our story did not begin with conquest or kings, but with kinship, with quiet. That before the floodplains were mapped and the heavens charted, there were simply people, watching the sky, wondering what it all meant. And perhaps that wonder is the oldest memory of all. Not the tools, not the monuments, not the grains stored in clay pots, but the question. The ache to understand where we came from and where we might go. And now, standing in the present, we inherit that same question. We live at another threshold, technological, ecological, existential, and once again, memory is our compass. The past is not behind us, it is beneath us, within us, carried forward in bone, in breath, in story, and it waits for how we will remember next. Because memory, like the earth itself, is layered, stratified, compressed under pressure, yes, but not destroyed. The stories of the Stone Age are still there, beneath the paved roads, beneath the high-rises, beneath the glowing screens. They are in the rhythms of our instincts, in the rituals we perform without knowing their origin, in the quiet moments when we sit by a fire or walk barefoot on soil and feel, though we cannot explain why, that we are part of something older than ourselves. This final chapter is not an ending. It is a doorway. We call it the end of prehistory, but in truth, that term only reflects our limits, our inability to read what wasn't written. What we call history is simply the fraction of the human past that left marks in ink or stone. But the rest, the vast echoing chamber of experience, myth, movement and being, that remains alive in other ways. We see it in the intuitive knowledge passed from grandmother to child, in the folk stories that persist at the edges of language, in the sacred silence of landscapes that have held human attention for tens of thousands of years. A cave becomes a chapel, a path becomes a pilgrimage. We do not invent meaning, we inherit it. And yet, with each passing generation, something slips. Not out of malice, but out of momentum. We forget that there was a time when to live was to remember, when memory was not stored in books or clouds, but in the breath of a community, in the pace of the seasons, in the curve of a hill where someone once wept and someone else was born. Now, on the other side of the agricultural revolution, the urban revolution, the industrial revolution, we are once again surrounded by noise, but beneath it, if we listen closely, the ancient memory still hums. It tells us, there was a time when humans lived without borders, when our ancestors walked for years, never seeing a fence, when they watched stars without needing to own them, when they held each other not for profit or possession, but because the night was long and cold and full of mystery. It tells us, you're not alone, you never were, and maybe that is the final lesson of the Stone Age, not a collection of tools or fossils, but a different grammar of being, a way of belonging to the world rather than trying to master it, a memory not etched in words, but in presence. So we return, as all stories do, to the beginning, to the fire and the circle, to the sky and the silence. And we ask once again, where did we come from? What did we lose? And in remembering, what might we still reclaim? This is the edge of memory, and we are standing on it, listening. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long arc across the dawn of time, through ashes, handprints, footsteps, and flame, for tracing the quiet emergence of who we are. If this story helped you feel the weight of memory, the hush of wonder, or the fragile spark of connection, thank you for holding space with us. Perhaps there was a single moment that stayed with you, an image, a gesture, a silence that echoed louder than speech. Whether it was the soft outline of a hand on limestone, the glint of obsidian beside a buried child, or the rustle of grain at the foot of a forgotten shrine, these fragments become the threads that bind us to something older than words. If one of them whispered to you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments, not as noise, but as a quiet offering to this small community of listeners and wanderers. And if you'd like to keep travelling with us through dust, myth, memory, and all the strange futures still to come, consider subscribing or sharing this with someone who still listens closely. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,